There is a city that should not exist anymore. It was destroyed, officially. A thermobaric missile strike leveled it in the early hours of October 1st, 1998, and the United States government told the world it was a necessary tragedy, a contained viral outbreak, a sad footnote in the history of a pharmaceutical company that had grown too reckless and paid the price. The people who knew the truth were scattered, discredited, or dead. The survivors who crawled out of that burning city went on to live fractured lives, carrying the weight of what they had seen in ways that no therapist and no amount of time could ever fully address. The world moved on. New disasters arrived. New horrors replaced old ones. Raccoon City faded into the kind of memory that people only visit when they want to remind themselves that things really can go catastrophically wrong. But the ruins are still there, sitting in a cordon zone, wrapped in government quarantine tape, and layers of bureaucratic silence that have grown thicker with every passing year. The buildings that survived the strike are still standing, half collapsed, moss-covered, stripped down to their bones by 28 years of weather and neglect. The streets are still there, cracked and buckled, choked with vegetation that has learned to grow through concrete because nothing told it not to. And deep underneath all of that, buried beneath the orphanage district, beneath the ash and the memory and the weight of everything that happened, there is a laboratory that nobody was supposed to find. That laboratory holds a secret that Oswell Spencer carried to his grave, a secret that has spent almost 3 decades locked away in the dark, waiting for the right person to walk in and understand what they were looking at. A secret that changes everything we thought we knew about Umbrella's founder, about the company's legacy, and about whether the damage that started in 1998 can ever truly be undone. This is the story of Resident Evil Requiem. This is the story of a woman walking into the worst night of her life and coming out the other side with something she never expected to find. This is the story of a man who has spent the better part of 3 decades fighting monsters, finally realizing the monster living inside his own bloodstream. And this is the story of a city that never really stopped haunting the people it touched, even after it was gone. Get comfortable, let the room go quiet around you, and let us start from the very beginning. After the first section, drop a comment, letting me know where and when you are watching this. Whether it is 2 in the morning on a rainy Tuesday, or a lazy Sunday afternoon with the lights turned low, I want to know where this story finds you. And if you are enjoying the vibe, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps more than you might think, and it keeps these kinds of deep, slow storytelling videos coming. Chapter 1. The World 28 Years Later. Raccoon City's Long Shadow. To understand what Resident Evil Requiem is about at its deepest level, you need to understand what the Raccoon City incident actually did to the people who survived it. Not to the world in the abstract geopolitical sense, not to the pharmaceutical industry or the bioweapons black market, but to the individual human beings who walked out of that city on the 1st of October, 1998, and then had to figure out what to do with the rest of their lives. Most of them were ordinary people. They were not STARS operatives or government agents. They were not trained soldiers or seasoned crisis responders. They were a nurse finishing a night shift, a college student who happened to be visiting, a police officer on his very first day, a reporter chasing a story she had no idea would nearly kill her, an unemployed man who had stopped at a bar for a drink before the city started falling apart around him. Regular people drop out without warning into circumstances that violated every baseline assumption human beings make about how reality operates. When you are exposed to a viral outbreak of that scale, when you personally witness the transformation of your neighbors and coworkers and strangers on the street into something that should not exist, it does not leave you the same way food poisoning leaves you. It does not fade the way a car accident fades. It becomes structural. It gets woven into the architecture of how you process every subsequent experience, how you assess danger, how you relate to other people, how you sleep at night. The Raccoon City survivors carried that architecture with them everywhere they went. Some of them managed. They found ways to rebuild some semblance of normal life, to compartmentalize the experience deeply enough that it functioned in the background rather than constantly flooding the foreground. They had careers and families and routines. They laughed at things. They went on vacations. From the outside, they looked okay, But the body remembers what the mind tries to suppress, and the body of a Raccoon City survivor had been exposed to something that was still quietly doing its work. The Raccoon City syndrome, as it would eventually be identified and named by a man with very dark intentions, is clinically designated as latent onset T-virus syndrome. The description is precise and deeply unsettling once you understand its full implications. The T-virus, the organism that Umbrella developed through decades of research into the progenitor virus, does not always produce immediate acute infection. In a small percentage of individuals, exposure to the virus triggers the immune system to mount a response strong enough to suppress the active infection without eliminating the viral presence entirely. These individuals do not turn. They do not develop visible mutations. They survive the outbreak, walk out of the quarantine zone, and appear to be completely uninfected. But the virus never leaves. It goes dormant, suppressed by the host's antibodies, tucked into cellular structures where the immune system cannot fully reach it. And in the years following the initial exposure, in the decades of ordinary life, the dormant viral particles do what viruses inevitably do. They adapt. They study the antibodies containing them, identify their weaknesses, and over a long, quiet timeline, they evolve past those weaknesses. The immune response that was sufficient to contain the virus in 1998 becomes gradually insufficient to contain the virus in 2026. The suppression fails. The virus activates. The activation does not happen instantly. It progresses in stages that have a terrible clarity to them once you understand the underlying biology. Stage 0 is dormancy, the long, quiet period where nothing appears wrong and nothing unusual would show up on a standard medical examination. Stage 1 is activation, characterized by the appearance of dark, bruise-like lesions on the skin that do not fade and do not respond to any conventional treatment, accompanied by a general malaise that the infected person often dismisses as stress, or fatigue, or the ordinary consequences of middle age. Stage 2 is development, where the lesions spread across larger portions of the body and begin affecting internal organs, causing numbness, difficulty with motor control, and in more advanced cases, internal bleeding that manifests as occasional vomiting of blood. Stage 3 is terminal. The lesions have covered the entire body by this point. The pain is intense enough to be incapacitating. Fatigue becomes extreme. Death follows within 1 to 2 hours of entering this final stage. There is no recorded case of survival in the medical literature beyond that terminal stage. Or rather, there was no recorded case of survival at the point in time where the story of Requiem begins. By October of 2026, 6 former Raccoon City survivors have died from what appears to be an accelerating viral syndrome. The deaths are documented by the FBI and flagged as suspicious because the victims share a highly specific epidemiological history. They all survived the same incident. They all show the same progression of dark lesions. They all died in the same manner, their bodies found in conditions that suggest rapid deterioration. The case lands on the desk of FBI intelligence analyst Grace Ashcroft, Leon S. Kennedy receives word of the same deaths through different channels. He is a Division of Security Operations agent with a long history of bioterrorism response, and the details of this case pattern match things he has seen before in ways that make the back of his neck cold. He begins investigating. He is also dying. He has been hiding it under a pair of gloves that he wears regardless of weather or social context, because the lesions on his hand have reached the level of development where they cannot be explained away to a casual observer. He has been hiding it from everyone around him, including Sherry Birkin, his partner, who wears gloves of her own and has been hiding the same thing from him. Both of them were in Raccoon City. Both of them carry the dormant virus. Both of them are watching it slowly come alive inside their bodies, like something waking from a very long sleep. The weight of what that means is difficult to describe in clinical terms. Leon is a man who has spent nearly 3 decades walking into situations designed to kill him and walking back out again through a combination of exceptional skill, impossible luck, and the kind of stubborn refusal to stay down that has characterized everything about his professional life since his first night as a rookie police officer in a city that was already burning. He has survived Spanish gangs in rural Europe, a laboratory full of things designed specifically to end human life, the direct malevolence of Albert Wesker on multiple occasions, and more bioterrorist incidents than any single person should have reason to encounter across an entire career. He knows how to manage fear. He knows how to function under pressure. But there is something qualitatively different about carrying a death sentence in your own bloodstream. About looking at your hand under bright light and watching the darkness spreading through the skin, knowing it will keep spreading no matter what you do, knowing that the thing killing you was placed inside you 28 years ago by an infrastructure of corporate greed and unchecked ambition, and that there is almost certainly nothing you can do to stop it. That knowledge sits differently than the awareness of external danger. It does not sharpen you the way external danger does. It erodes you, quietly, from the inside. Leon is investigating the deaths of Raccoon City survivors while being one himself. And as the investigation develops, as the trail of bodies leads him toward a specific location in the Midwest, and a specific individual who appears to be connected to all of it, he carries that quiet erosion with him. He is running out of time in a way that feels entirely different from every other deadline he has ever operated under. The Raccoon City syndrome is not just a plot mechanism in Requiem. It is the emotional spine of the entire story, the thing that gives every scene involving Leon its particular weight. Every action he takes, every risk he accepts, every choice he makes in the ruins of the city that gave him his defining trauma, he makes it while aware that he might not see the outcome. He carries the past and the future simultaneously, and neither of them are comfortable places to live. There is also something worth sitting with in the way the syndrome was initially identified and documented. Victor Gideon is the person who named it. Victor Gideon, the former Umbrella researcher whose facility outside Renwood has been using the modified T virus on involuntary subjects for years, who understood the biological mechanisms of Raccoon City syndrome because he was watching it develop in his experimental cohort as part of his broader research into progenitor-derived agents. He named the disease after the city rather than after its clinical mechanism, the latent onset to virus syndrome that its clinical designation describes, because the naming choice served purposes that had nothing to do with medical accuracy. Naming the disease after Raccoon City makes it sound like a specific, contained phenomenon associated with a specific historical event. Latent onset T-virus syndrome sounds like what it actually is, a category of disease that could theoretically affect anyone infected with any T-virus strain, from any umbrella incident across 3 decades of bioterrorist events. If the syndrome is defined by its association with Raccoon City, the investigative and public health response remains focused on a specific historical population. If it is defined by its biological mechanism, the scope of inquiry expands to encompass every subsequent bioterrorism incident and potentially every survivor of every umbrella-related outbreak in the franchise's history. Gideon named it strategically. He was not publicizing his discovery to advance medical understanding. He was controlling the narrative around it to serve his own research goals, ensuring that the cases he needed to study, the Raccoon City survivors, would be concentrated and documentable without the broader attention that a correctly named syndrome might have attracted from public health authorities, who would have asked difficult questions about how a private researcher at a chronic care facilities happened to identify a novel viral syndrome before any major public health institution. This is a small detail that the game buries in its documentation, but it is the kind of detail that reveals the full architecture of Gideon's methodology. He is not simply a villain who does bad things. He is a person who has internalized a framework in which every person in every situation exists. It exists as a resource to be managed toward his specific objectives, in which the language we use to describe reality is itself a tool for managing it, in which there is no such thing as neutral observation, because all observation serves some purpose, and the only question is whether you are choosing the purpose consciously or having it chosen for you. Spencer thought that way too. It is one of the most disturbing threads running through the Resident Evil universe's treatment of Umbrella's history, the way that Spencer's worldview did not die with the company, but persisted in the people it trained, distributed through the intellectual legacy of an organization that is officially bankrupt, but operationally very much alive in the minds of the people it formed. Gideon did not become what he is despite studying under Spencer's influence. He became what he is because of it. The methodology was always embedded in the vision. The other thing you need to understand about the world of Requiem is the status of Raccoon City itself, because the game returns to that location in a way that the series has not done since Resident Evil 3 in 1999, and what you find when you get there is both familiar and profoundly different. The ruins of Raccoon City are still cordoned off by the government, still officially quarantined, still presented publicly as a site too hazardous for habitation or investigation. What this means in practical terms is that the ruins are largely left alone, monitored from a distance, periodically patrolled by government and BSAA assets who are instructed to ensure that nothing comes out and nothing unauthorized goes in. What the quarantine does not account for, because no quarantine ever does, is what has been happening underground in the years since the strike. The surface ruins are visible, the underground is not, and something has been growing down there, in the dark, in the spaces beneath the orphanage district, in a facility that was never listed in any umbrella corporate filing or any government assessment of the company's assets. A facility that Oswell Spencer built specifically to be unfindable, specifically to hold something that could not be trusted to any other location, something so significant and so dangerous in its implications that he wanted it buried far enough from the surface that the casual catastrophe of a thermobaric missile strike would pass entirely above it. That facility is called the Ark, and understanding what it holds and why it was built requires understanding the man who built it, which means going all the way back to the beginning of the version of Oswell Spencer that Requiem presents, a version that is substantially more complicated than anything previous games in the series had allowed him to be. But we will get there. First, we need to meet the woman who starts this story. We need to understand who Grace Ashcroft is before we understand what she means to the people who have been hunting her for nearly half her life. And to understand Grace, we have to start with her mother, because Grace's entire story is, at its root, about what a daughter inherits from the woman who raised her. Chapter 2. Grace Ashcroft. The reluctant investigator. There is a specific kind of loneliness that develops when you have a secret so large you cannot share it with anyone around you, and nobody around you knows that the secret exists. It is not the loneliness of social isolation or emotional disconnection. It is the loneliness of carrying a weight that would change how everyone sees you if they knew you were carrying it, so you become very skilled at appearing weightless. You learn to smile at the right moments. You learn to answer questions about how you are doing with the word fine in a way that closes the conversation rather than opening it. You develop a facility for being present in a room while most of your actual attention is somewhere else entirely, processing things that cannot be processed in company. Grace Ashcroft, when the story of Requiem begins, is 25 years old and has been practicing this particular form of loneliness for about 8 of those years. She works as an FBI technical intelligence analyst, which means she spends her days inside databases and data streams and analysis matrices, applying a mind that is genuinely exceptional at pattern recognition to the problem of finding order in large collections of seemingly unrelated information. She is good at her job, exceptionally good, in the specific way that very introverted, very focused, very internally driven people sometimes become exceptional at technical tasks because the task allows them to be fully present without the exhausting overhead of navigating human social dynamics. She has been at the Bureau for 3 years. Before that, she completed a double major in computer science and forensic analysis, which is the kind of academic combination that produces exactly the skill set needed for intelligence work in the current technological environment, and also the kind of combination that allows a person to spend 4 years in a university setting without ever having to be continuously present in the physical company of other people for extended periods. You can do that coursework largely alone. Grace did. Her apartment, as briefly glimpsed in the game's opening sequence before she receives her assignment, is functional rather than personal. There are books, organized by subject and then by author, because the organizational system was one of the first things she established when she moved in, and maintaining it takes almost no ongoing effort because it was right the first time. There are photographs on one shelf, 3 of them, all containing her mother, no photographs of anyone else, no evidence of an active social network in the physical artifacts of her domestic space. The apartment belongs fully to the person who lives in it and reveals very little about that person to anyone who does not already know her. She eats at her desk. She works late in a way that her supervisor Nathan Dempsey has noticed, without quite finding the opening to address directly, because her work product is exceptional and the work environment does not give him easy language for the concern that she is using professional commitment as a substitute for things she cannot find elsewhere. He is not wrong. She knows he is not wrong. She has no particular interest in changing the dynamic. She does not do well in the field. She was issued a firearm as part of her FBI credentials, and she has completed the mandatory qualification courses, but she has never fired a weapon at anything other than a paper target. She has never been in a situation that required her to make a real-time combat decision. Her work is not that kind of work. Her work happens in controlled environments, behind screens and security clearances, and she has built her professional identity around the specific skills those environments reward. She is, in the words of director Koshi Nakanishi, the biggest person who is afraid in Resident Evil history. That framing is precise and a little reductive, but not inaccurate. Grace experiences fear the way a normal person would experience fear in the situations that Resident Evil protagonists routinely encounter. She does not have the combat conditioning of Leon Kennedy, the special forces training of Chris Redfield, or the relentless adaptability of Jill Valentine. When she encounters something monstrous, her body responds with the full biological complement of terror, the racing heart, the shallow breathing, the instinct to become small and still and invisible, the desperate desire to be anywhere else in the world except the place she currently is. She is afraid in a way that is immediately recognizable to anyone who has ever been genuinely terrified, which is part of what makes her so effective as a protagonist for the specific horror the game is trying to deliver. But she is also incredibly smart, frighteningly analytical. Her ability to remain calm enough to think, when her nervous system is flooding her with every possible signal to run, is rooted not in training, but in character. In a stubbornness that probably comes from the same place as her mother's stubbornness, a refusal to let fear make all her decisions for her. She is scared constantly throughout Requiem, and she keeps moving anyway. Her mother was Alyssa Ashcroft. If you have played Resident Evil Outbreak or its sequel, you know that name. Alyssa was an investigative reporter for the Raccoon Press in 1998. One of the 8 civilians who managed to survive the Raccoon City outbreak through a combination of resourcefulness, determination, and the kind of desperate improvisational competence that ordinary people sometimes discover in themselves when everything else has been stripped away. She was not trained for what happened to her. She was a journalist chasing a story about corporate malfeasance, and the story turned out to be catastrophically larger and more dangerous than she had understood. She survived Raccoon City, and then she spent years doing exactly what she had always done. She wrote about what she had seen. She investigated. She documented. She pushed the story into public consciousness through every channel available to her, persistent and methodical and relentless in the way that effective investigative journalists are relentless. She was discredited repeatedly by Umbrella's legal and public relations machinery, which was substantial and well-funded, and had many years of practice managing exactly this kind of threat. Dismissed as unstable, unreliable, too personally invested in her subject matter to be objective. The standard toolkit for dismantling an inconvenient witness. But she did not stop. Even after Umbrella went bankrupt in 2003, even after the corporation's collapse removed the most obvious target from her institutional crosshairs, Alyssa kept pulling threads because the threads kept leading somewhere, because the story did not end with Umbrella's corporate death, because the machinery that had produced Raccoon City and every disaster that followed was not destroyed with the company, it was dispersed, fragmented, absorbed into other structures, changed in form but not in nature. In 2004, Alyssa managed something extraordinary. She secured an interview with Oswell Spencer himself, the reclusive founder of Umbrella, who by that point had retreated from any public visibility and was reportedly in serious physical decline. How she obtained the interview is not fully explained in the game's documents, but given what we know of Alyssa's determination and the length of time she had been pursuing the Umbrella story, the simplest explanation is that she had accumulated enough investigative leverage to make the interview beneficial for Spencer in ways that outweighed his desire for continued isolation. The interview was recorded. Alyssa saved it to a memory device that she kept with her, and the content of that interview is the most important piece of information in the entire game, the fulcrum on which the whole story turns. Though it will not be revealed until very late in the narrative, and will not be fully understood until Grace herself has walked a very long way toward understanding who she is. What we know about the interview at this point in the story is limited. Spencer, near the end of his life, chose to grant access to the journalist who had spent years trying to expose him. He had something to say. He wanted to say it on the record, to someone who had earned the right to hear it through sustained moral seriousness. He called it a requiem for those who had passed. He gave Alyssa something more than an interview. He gave her a child, Grace, an orphaned infant who Spencer had taken in sometime in the years following the Raccoon City incident. A child he presented to Alyssa not as a research subject or an asset, but as exactly what he said she was. A normal girl he had taken in to make amends. His hope. Spencer died in 2006. He was killed by Albert Wesker, who had spent years maneuvering himself into position for that moment, and who felt no particular emotion about ending the life of the man who had shaped his entire existence and then discarded him. Wesker died 3 years later in a volcano in Africa, killed by Chris Redfield and Sheva Alomar, his bioweapon-enhanced body finally failing against a sustained assault that would have ended any other human being many times over. After Spencer's death, his butler contacted Alyssa and informed her of her responsibilities as Grace's legal guardian. Alyssa accepted. She changed Grace's surname to Ashcroft. She raised her daughter. She never told Grace who she had been before, or who Spencer was, or what the interview contained, or why a man like Spencer would make the specific choice of placing an infant in the care of a journalist who had spent years investigating him. She kept those threads separate from the ordinary fabric of Grace's childhood, intending perhaps to tell her someday when Grace was old enough to receive the information, when the weight of it would not be crushing. She ran out of time before that day arrived. In October of 2018, Alyssa was killed. She was working a case following a thread that had led her to a hotel in a small Midwestern city called Wrenwood, located near the quarantine zone around the ruins of Raccoon City. The hotel was called the Wrenwood Hotel. Grace was 16 years old. She was with her mother. She saw it happen. A man with a machete, an act of targeted violence. Her mother dead on the hotel floor. Grace left behind with a grief so large and so sudden that it short-circuited her emotional development in ways she was still unpacking 8 years later. The trauma calcified into the internal architecture that now sits beneath everything she does, every professional choice she makes, every relationship she keeps at arm's length, because getting close to people means having something to lose. She became an analyst. She went into the FBI. She built a career around the careful and impersonal examination of information, around the safe distance of a screen between herself and the dangers she spent her days cataloging. And she carried her mother's death with her, in the specific quiet way of someone who has had a very long time to learn to carry it without showing the weight. When she is assigned to investigate the latest in a string of mysterious deaths at the Wrenwood Hotel, when her supervisor Nathan Dempsey tells her that a body has been found in the same building where her mother died, she agrees to go. She says yes, because she wants to understand what happened to Alyssa, because she has wanted that understanding for 8 years, and the closest she has ever come to the answer has been the absence of information, the careful, professional blankness of a case file that was never truly resolved. Going back to the Wrenwood Hotel means going back to the worst moment of her life. She does it anyway. That choice, that decision to walk back into grief rather than away from it, is who Grace Ashcroft is at her fundamental level. She is a person defined by what she lost. She is also a person who has never stopped, not for a single day of her adult life, moving toward the truth she knows is somewhere on the other side of that loss. She arrives at Wrenwood on October 8th, 2026. She has no idea that a former Umbrella scientist has been watching her movements for years. She has no idea that a man named Victor Gideon arranged this specific murder at this specific location, specifically to draw her back to the hotel where her mother died. She has no idea that within the next 48 hours, she will be kidnapped, will wake up strapped to a table in a facility full of experiments that should not exist, and will encounter a blind child who changes everything she understands about what kind of person she is. She arrives at Wrenwood thinking she is going to collect evidence and write a report. She has no idea the report she is going to write will be the most important document in the series' 30-year history. Chapter 3, The Wrenwood Hotel, Where Grief Meets Horror. The Wrenwood Hotel is the kind of building that holds on to history the way old wood holds on to cold. It was a reasonably successful establishment once, catering to travelers passing through a mid-sized Midwestern city that positioned itself as a gateway to the recreational opportunities of the surrounding region. It hosted conventions and family reunions, and the occasional business traveler who preferred the old-fashioned solidity of a building with actual architecture to the anonymous efficiency of a chain hotel off the highway. It has been closed for 8 years. Since the murder of a freelance journalist in October of 2018, the building has been listed as a crime scene, cycled through administrative limbo between the local police and the federal government, and ultimately left in a kind of institutional purgatory where nobody officially owns the responsibility of doing anything with it. It is scheduled for demolition at some point in the near future, which is one of the reasons the recent murder on the premises was flagged as unusual enough to warrant federal attention. Someone chose to commit a crime in a building that is about to cease to exist. That specificity of location suggests intent rather than opportunity. Grace arrives in the early evening and is met by a local officer named Norman Cole, who fills her in on the basic facts of the recent death, warns her that the building is structurally compromised in places, and makes it gently but clearly apparent that he considers this an unnecessary federal intrusion into what is probably a straightforward local matter. Grace ignores the subtext and goes inside. The hotel in the dark is exactly as oppressive as you would expect a building to be when it is simultaneously the site of your childhood trauma and a recent crime scene, and a structure that is slowly consuming itself from within. The carpets have absorbed years of moisture. The wallpaper has detached from the walls in long strips. The furniture is still there in many of the rooms, still arranged in the configurations it occupied when the hotel was operational, draped in the dust of 8 years of abandonment. It is the kind of space that communicates, through purely physical means, the message that time here has not been kind. Grace is a trained analyst. She approaches the building professionally. She is looking for a data disk that her supervisor mentioned, evidence left behind by the previous victim that might illuminate the connection between this death and the others she has been tracking. She also has a room key, a key to room 204, the room where she and her mother stayed the night Alyssa was killed. Someone placed that key where she would find it. The placement is deliberate. It is an invitation to go to a specific location. And Grace is smart enough to know that. And she goes anyway, because the alternative is turning around and leaving the building, and that is the one thing she cannot make herself do. Inside room 204, she finds a photograph, a picture of herself as a child, placed where she would find it. The photograph has no obvious explanation. Nobody should have it. It was not left by the previous victim. It predates the recent murder by years. It is a message from someone who has been watching her for long enough to have documented her childhood, directed at a location that only someone who knew her mother's history could have chosen. She finds her mother's data disk in the same room, hidden exactly where Alyssa had time to conceal it before everything went wrong 8 years ago. The disk contains the interview. Grace does not have the means to view it there and then, but she has it. She puts it in her pocket. Then Victor Gideon introduces himself by knocking her unconscious before she has the chance to process what is happening. The abduction is precise and fast in the way that only planned abductions are. Gideon was waiting for her. He had the approach calculated, the exit route prepared, the mechanism for triggering a distraction to occupy the local officer and anyone else who might intervene. He triggers a small outbreak, infecting a handful of nearby civilians with a modified T-virus strain to create enough chaos in the streets to guarantee that Leon Kennedy, who has been tracking the same case from a different angle, is occupied with the immediate threat rather than able to reach Grace before Gideon's vehicle is already gone. Leon sees it happen. He is close enough to witness the abduction and far enough to be unable to stop it. He watches Victor Gideon drive away with Grace Ashcroft in the back of a vehicle, and then he turns around to deal with the infected civilians spreading through the street behind him, because that is also something he cannot leave unaddressed, and by the time the immediate threat is contained, there is nothing left to pursue. Sherry Birkin gets him a location, Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center, a medical facility about 30 minutes outside Wrenwood. registered under a corporate shell that traces back through several layers of financial camouflage to a company that bought the building from its previous owner in 2003. The previous owner was the Spencer Foundation. Leon gets in his car. His left hand, under the glove, is darker than it was this morning. Meanwhile, Grace wakes up strapped to a table. Chapter 4. Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center, Hell in a Hospital. The Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center presents, from the outside, exactly what its name suggests. A large medical facility set in the rolling countryside outside Wrenwood, with the clean lines and manicured grounds that institutional healthcare establishments maintain, partly for practical reasons and partly because the visual language of order and calm is itself a form of marketing to the people who need to trust you with their most vulnerable family members. The building is substantial without being imposing. It communicates competence. It communicates that professional, experienced people manage the things that happen inside it and that everything is under control. This is one of the more sophisticated lies in the Resident Evil universe, and that is a fairly competitive category. When Grace regains consciousness, she is in the East Wing. Her wrists are restrained. There is an intravenous line in her arm draining blood into a collection vessel beside the table. Her head is thick with the residue of whatever sedative was used to keep her quiet during transport. The room is hospital white and clean and absolutely silent. The silence is the first thing that is wrong. Hospital environments are not quiet. They hum with machinery and footsteps and the ambient audio of a building that has many people in it, performing many different functions simultaneously. This room is so quiet that the sound of her own heartbeat is audible to her. She understands fairly quickly that calling for help is unlikely to produce useful results. She takes the time to steady her breathing, to stop the panic response before it consumes her capacity to think, to assess the room with the same analytical focus she brings to everything else. The assessment takes a few minutes. The assessment is not encouraging, but it does identify the specific weak point in her restraints that allows her to free herself. And then she goes exploring, because Grace Ashcroft does not sit in rooms waiting for someone else to determine what happens to her. The care center is a survival horror environment in the most complete sense of the phrase. Not because it is overrun with obvious external threats, though it becomes that eventually, but because the horror is distributed throughout the facility in ways that reveal themselves gradually, like peeling back layers of something that becomes increasingly difficult to look at the deeper you go. There are patients in locked rooms, patients who should be receiving chronic care in comfortable surroundings, who are instead in conditions that suggest the clinical infrastructure exists primarily to maintain their physical viability as research subjects, rather than to address their medical needs in any meaningful sense. There are documents that should not exist in a legitimate medical facility. Research notes written in the clean, clinical language of scientific methodology applied to processes that no ethics board anywhere in the world would sanction. Victor Gideon has been running experiments in this building for years. The experimental subjects were not volunteers. They were not even properly informed. They were people whose vulnerability, whose chronic illness, whose desperation for treatment of conditions that legitimate medicine had not been able to address, was leveraged into a consent process that nobody could honestly call consensual. The irony embedded in the building's name is complete once you understand what is happening inside it. A chronic care center exists, in the conventional medical sense, to provide ongoing management and quality of life improvement to people with conditions that cannot be cured, that require sustained attention and intervention over extended periods. The philosophy of chronic care is patient-centered by necessity. You cannot cure the condition, so you optimize the experience of living with it. You prioritize dignity and comfort and the patient's own understanding of what constitutes acceptable quality of life. Gideon has inverted this entirely. The patients in his facility are not receiving care in any meaningful sense of the word. They are receiving management in the specific way that experimental subjects are managed. Their biological stability maintained precisely to the level required to make them useful as data points, rather than to the level that would optimize their own experience of being alive. Their suffering, where present, is documented rather than addressed. It is, from Gideon's perspective, information. The pain response to a particular experimental intervention tells him something about how the viral strain is interacting with the subject's immune system. The data is more valuable to him than the comfort of the person generating it. This is an extreme version of a logic that runs through the Resident Evil universe's history of corporate and institutional evil. The logic that places organizational objectives so far above the interests of individual people that the people stop registering as having interests at all. They become resources, inputs, data sources. The complete removal of individual humanity from the calculus of institutional decision-making is how organizations get to Raccoon City. It is how they get to the baker's farm. It is how they get to this building, where the chronic care center's signage still reads as though it means what it says. The virus he has been working with is a modified strain of the T virus. Not the original Epsilon strain that flooded Raccoon City in 1998, but something that evolved from it, something that he has been engineering and refining over years of trial and error with the specific goal of understanding how it interacts with different immune profiles, different genetic backgrounds, different pre-existing conditions. He has been cataloging the results. The catalog is extensive and thorough and deeply disturbing to read. He has also been creating. The connections, the shadowy organization that Gideon has been working with, provided access to cloning technology and specific genetic material, and Gideon has been using that access to produce something that the ARC laboratory beneath Raccoon City needs but cannot generate without external input. The cloning program is documented in files scattered throughout the care center, described in the same detached professional language as everything else. And it takes most of the care center section of the game to accumulate enough pieces of the picture to understand what you are actually looking at. The shape of that picture is this. Somebody needs to access the ARC. The ARC can only be accessed using a specific genetic code, a biological keys derived from a specific person whose identity and location were, until recently, unknown to the people who needed that key. Gideon's research into this problem produced clones, many of them, attempts to replicate the genetic profile in question sufficiently to serve as a substitute key. None of the attempts were successful. The clones did not match. The biological lock required something more specific, more authentic than any copy could provide. The clones are in the facility, 2 of them, designated by the research documentation as Subject 170 and Subject 171, though Grace will come to know them by different names. One of them, Marie, is missing from her containment area. There is a hole dug through the glass partition of her room, and the documentation suggests she escaped to the basement some time ago. The documentation also suggests, without exactly saying it, that Marie is not in the condition she was in when she was a research subject, that whatever was done to her has produced changes that make the word escaped somewhat inadequate as a description of what has happened. The other clone is Emily. She is behind glass in the isolation ward. She is young, perhaps 7 or 8 years old in appearance, small and very still, with eyes that are open and staring, and completely clouded by the damage done to her visual cortex by the procedures Gideon applied to her in the course of his experiments. She is blind. She has been blind since shortly after she was first brought to this facility. Jeff Gray, a staff member who Grace encounters in the advanced stages of dying, screams at her to stay away from Emily. He screams it with a desperation that goes beyond professional concern, with the kind of urgency that belongs to personal terror. Grace does not stay away from Emily. Emily, for her part, reaches toward the glass when Grace approaches. She is not afraid. She cannot see the woman standing outside her enclosure, but she can hear her, and something in the quality of the sound of Grace's presence is not like the quality of the other sounds she has been surrounded by. Grace's presence does not read as threat. Grace's presence reads as something she has not encountered in this building before, something she does not have a word for, but reaches toward instinctively. Grace begins working on how to get Emily out. At the same time, in a different part of the facility, Leon Kennedy arrives. Leon comes through the facility in a way that is categorically different from how Grace navigates it. Where Grace is hiding and evading and using her analytical mind to identify solutions that do not require direct confrontation with things that would easily overpower her, Leon is making the kind of decisive, forward-moving progression through obstacles that decades of operational experience in bioterrorism response produce. He is not invulnerable. He is infected and deteriorating, and his symptoms are visibly advancing as the stress of combat accelerates the biological process that his antibodies are losing the ability to contain. But he has the training and the weapons and the bone-deep institutional memory of knowing how to function in crisis environments, and he uses all of it. He also has the Requiem, a custom handgun that will become significant later in more ways than one. It is a weapon built specifically for situations like this, firing rounds with stopping power well beyond what the caliber would suggest, accurate in the ways that matter when you are dealing with things that do not stop easily. He gives it to Grace when their paths cross briefly in the facility because he has assessed the situation and concluded that she is going to need it more than he needs it at this particular moment, and that the best thing he can do for her in the immediate short term is ensure she has some means of defense before Gideon triggers the lockdown that separates them. Gideon does trigger the lockdown. The shutters come down, the facility compartmentalizes, and Grace is alone again, in a building that is now fully active with the modified T-virus Gideon has released into the ventilation system, moving through corridors full of things that used to be the facility's staff and patients and are now something else entirely. She has the gun. She also has something following her, something large and fast and absolutely silent in its movement despite its size, that she becomes aware of through a series of sounds that are wrong in the specific way that only sounds produced by something that has learned to move without being heard are wrong. The girl does not hunt with noise. The girl hunts with patience, with the intelligence that is animal in its focus and human in its tactical awareness, with the particular terror of a predator that seems to understand the prey's attempts at concealment and works around them systematically. She comes through walls. She comes through ceilings. She is immune to conventional weapons fire in a way that Grace discovers the hard way, emptying a magazine into something that absorbs the rounds and keeps moving. The only thing that stops her is light. Direct, sustained, high-intensity light. In sufficient quantity, light melts her. This is a piece of information that costs Grace significant stress and ammunition to discover, and it is a piece of information that will matter significantly later. But for now, she needs to find Emily. She needs to find a way out, and she needs to not die in a medical facility that should not exist. What she finds in the research archives changes the shape of what she thought was happening, because the research files contain references to a cloning program that traces back not just to Gideon's own work, but to an older program, a program run by Umbrella itself in a specific location. And the genetic profile at the center of all of it, the profile that the clones were imperfectly replicating, is one that has a connection to the Raccoon City orphanage district that implies a history Grace had no idea she possessed. She does not have time to process all of it. She needs to get Emily. She needs to get out. She gets Emily. She gets almost out, and then Emily dies. It is quick, and it is terrible, and it is the kind of death that resets the emotional register of the story entirely. Grace performs CPR. She brings Emily back. And what comes back is not what went in, because the T-virus that Emily has been carrying, the version that was introduced into her system as part of Gideon's experiments, activates in the moment of metabolic stress produced by cardiac arrest and begins doing what T-virus does. Emily transforms. Leon arrives in time to prevent what Emily is becoming from killing Grace. He subdues her. He does it precisely and with clear reluctance and with obvious awareness of what it means to Grace. He shoots to incapacitate, aiming to avoid organs, because he has already decided that death is not what he intends for the child in front of him, but he cannot let what she is becoming continue its activity unchecked. Grace watches her daughter die for the second time in 3 minutes. Gideon, appearing in the aftermath with impeccable timing, makes an offer. He introduces his associate, a man named Zeno, who waits in a helicopter on the facility's roof. He tells Grace she is the key to something called Elpis. He tells her that Elpis is a project Spencer himself designed, that it has the potential to change the world, and that the only person who can unlock it is her, whether she currently understands why or not. Grace has just watched a child she was trying to protect transform into a monster and be subdued by a government agent. She is in a medical facility full of things that were recently staff members. She is furious, and she is in shock, and she does not have any particular reason to trust Victor Gideon, but she wants to know what Elpis is. She wants to know why she was brought here, why her mother was killed, why an umbrella scientist has been obsessing over her genetic profile for the better part of 20 years. She wants answers badly enough to willingly get into a helicopter with two of the people responsible for everything that has happened to her in the past 12 hours. She throws the Requiem back at Leon and walks out to the helicopter. Leon watches her go. He is going to follow. He is always going to follow, but he needs a moment first. He looks at his hand under the facility's overhead lights, at the darkness spreading up from his wrist toward his elbow, and he breathes in the way you breathe when you are actively choosing not to think about something. Then he goes after her. Chapter 5. Victor Gideon. The true believer. To understand Victor Gideon, you have to understand a specific type of devotion that exists outside normal moral frameworks. It is not the devotion of love or loyalty or even ideology in the conventional political sense. It is the devotion of the acolyte for the master, of the apprentice who has built an entire identity around the interpretation and continuation of someone else's vision. It is the devotion that makes a person genuinely incapable of imagining the world through any lens other than the one the master's work has given them. Gideon came to Umbrella as a researcher. He worked on the Tyrant Project, which was among the most ambitious and morally catastrophic of Umbrella's various bioweapon development programs. The program responsible for the Tyrant and eventually for Nemesis and for every hulking, barely contained apex predator that Umbrella deployed or attempted to deploy in the years before its corporate collapse. It was not subtle work. It was not the kind of work you do if you have significant ethical reservations about what you are contributing to. Gideon did it willingly. He was good at it. And at the center of his professional world was Oswell Spencer, whose intellectual framework for what Umbrella was supposed to achieve, whose vision of forced human evolution through viral mechanisms, whose absolute certainty that the project of redirecting the course of biological humanity was not only possible but necessary, provided Gideon with the ideological architecture he had apparently been looking for his entire adult life. Spencer was brilliant in the specific way that charismatic visionaries are brilliant, fully convinced of their own analysis, capable of articulating a worldview with the clarity and force that makes it feel like revelation rather than argument, and absolutely unmoved by the moral implications of acting on that worldview. Gideon worshipped him. When Umbrella went bankrupt in 2003, when the corporation's crimes became too documented and too public to sustain its institutional viability, most of its researchers scattered. Some were prosecuted, some went into legitimate pharmaceutical work, and spent years trying to put distance between themselves and their professional histories. Some went underground, finding new employment with the various shadowy organizations that had always existed on the periphery of bioweapon research, waiting for exactly this kind of talent dispersal. Gideon bought the Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center. The building had previously belonged to the Spencer Foundation, one of Spencer's many institutional holdings, and Gideon purchased it specifically because of that connection. He wanted to be somewhere Spencer had been. He wanted to be somewhere that still held the residue of Spencer's presence, where the walls themselves had been shaped by Spencer's resources and Spencer's purposes. He found what little of Spencer's research records were available to him and spent years reading them with the focused devotion of someone who has found their scripture. He eventually found references to something called Elpis. The name is Greek for hope. In Spencer's notes, the references were incomplete, the information strictly compartmentalized in a way that prevented the full picture from being assembled from any single source. But the fragments Gideon assembled pointed towards something he found electrifying. Spencer's last project, his final contribution to the field he had spent his life shaping, was a virus, a powerful, contagious, uniquely effective virus. The incomplete notes suggested it had properties that no previously developed progenitor-derived agent had achieved, including specifically the property of affecting higher cortical function, of changing the infected host's decision-making processes in ways that were controllable from the outside. A mind control virus, a mechanism for directing large populations at a biological level, for removing individual agency from the equation entirely, for creating the kind of absolute, irresistible influence that Spencer's vision of a directed human evolution had always implied as its logical endpoint. Gideon believed this because he wanted to believe it, because Spencer's vision of humanity reshaped by viral mechanisms required exactly this kind of endpoint to be coherent. Because a man who had built his identity around being the faithful continuation of Spencer's work needed the culmination of that work to be something worthy of the devotion he had invested. He needed Elpis to be the final step in Spencer's plan, the the piece that made everything else make sense. He was wrong, but we will not know that for quite some time, and the wrongness of his belief does not diminish the sincerity with which he held it. To find Elpis, Gideon needed access to the Ark. To access the Ark, he needed Grace Ashcroft's genetic profile, or a sufficiently accurate replica thereof. To understand why Grace's genetics were the key required understanding the last piece of Spencer's documented history, the Ark's biological security system, which was designed around a specific person's DNA in a way that made that person, or the genetic material derived from them, the only possible unlocking mechanism. Where Grace came from before Spencer took her in as an infant is unknown in Requiem. She is an orphan in the most complete sense, someone whose origins before her earliest documented history are simply absent from the record. What Gideon's research concluded, based on the partial information available to him from Spencer's incomplete notes, was that Grace must have been the product of Spencer's consciousness transfer experiments, one of the subjects at the Raccoon City orphanage where Umbrella had conducted research into the possibility of transferring identity between hosts. He believed she was the successful clone, the one whose genetic profile had been used to create the Ark's security system, the one who carried Spencer's own consciousness, transferred into a new body as Spencer's final act of self-preservation. He was wrong about this too, spectacularly, ironically wrong, in a way that the story will eventually make clear. But Gideon had spent years building this framework and had no reason to question it and significant psychological investment in not questioning it. He set about finding Grace and, when he could not find her directly, he found her mother. The murder at the Wrenwood Hotel in 2018 was not random. It was a targeted operation, Gideon sending an infected assassin to a specific location because Alyssa Ashcroft had come too close to the full picture of what Elpis actually was, and because Gideon needed Grace either secured or prevented from receiving the information Alyssa was carrying. The operation was imperfect. Alyssa died. The assassin died. Grace escaped. And the data disk Alyssa had been carrying, the disk containing the interview with Spencer, disappeared into the hotel along with the key to room 204. The 8 years between the murder and the game's present day are documented in Gideon's records, and they paint a picture of a man whose obsession has not diminished with time. If anything, the extended frustration of being unable to locate Grace has refined and intensified it. He knows her incomplete medical records. He has attempted to use them to calibrate the cloning program, producing Emily and Marie and a series of other numbered subjects who are variations on the same failed attempt. He has built a detailed profile of the target that encompasses her professional trajectory, her psychological characteristics derived from the limited available behavioral data, her physical characteristics documented in every official photograph her FBI employment produced. He knows her in the way that someone who has been thinking about a specific problem for 8 years knows all the approaches they have tried and why they failed. He does not know her in the way that any person who has actually spent time with another person knows them. He knows her as a lock. He knows her as the solution to a problem. The category error that places human beings into the role of instruments rather than people is so deeply embedded in his thinking at this point that he genuinely does not seem to experience it as an error. The Nemesis Gamma parasite is the most revealing choice Gideon has made, more revealing in some ways than anything else documented about him, because it was voluntary. Nobody forced him to undergo the surgery. Nobody extracted benefit from his physical enhancement in any direct or immediate sense. He did it because he anticipated eventual confrontation, because his analytical mind correctly identified that the path to the Ark was likely to involve resistance from people with operational capabilities significantly beyond his own, and because he decided that acquiring the physical capability to overcome that resistance was worth the permanent changes to his body that the parasite would produce. The surgery was performed by his own hand, with assistance from the small number of staff members in his facility who were loyal enough and compromised enough by their own participation in his research to be irreversibly committed to his interests. The parasite was sourced through Connections channels, a variant of the original Ne-alpha organism that powered the Nemesis project, modified to integrate with a cognitively intact host. The original Nemesis, the creature that stalked Jill Valentine through the streets of Raccoon City in 1998, had been a high-functioning T-virus body overwritten by the NE-alpha parasite's invasive neural network, stripped of most human cognition in exchange for combat capability that the original NE-alpha program was designed to maximize. The NEE-gamma variant retains far more of the host's cognitive architecture. It is a more sophisticated organism, one that has been refined over decades of umbrella research into parasitic bioweapons, one that is capable of integrating with a fully cognizant host without destroying the host's ability to think, plan, and direct the parasite's physical enhancements towards specific purposes. The physical changes it produces are visible but not extreme in the initial integration phase, which is partly by design and partly a function of how Gideon has been managing the integration through pharmaceutical suppression of the parasite's more aggressive amplification responses. He looks like a man who has had something done to him. That is the most accurate description of his physical appearance once Grace and Leon actually encounter him. The skin tone is wrong, mottled and gray in a way that natural variations in human skin never quite produce. His proportions are slightly off in a way that takes a moment to identify. The movements, when he moves, carry the quality of something that is not quite organized around the skeletal structure you would expect. He wears good clothes that fit well, which reads partly as the aesthetic of someone who has not abandoned his sense of professional presentation, despite everything, and partly as a deliberate effort to normalize his appearance to the degree possible. The goggles he wears are both functional and significant. They display real-time data about his environment, biometric readings, structural analysis of spaces he is moving through, the kind of enhanced situational awareness that a researcher who has spent decades in laboratory environments develops an appetite for, and that the NE-gamma parasite does not natively provide. He built them himself, or had them built to his specifications. They are an extension of his intellect into the enhanced body the parasite has given him, an insistence that even in physical transformation, he remains primarily a scientist, primarily someone who processes the world through the framework of information and analysis rather than through any purely physical register. The snake imagery that runs through his character design is not accidental. The forked tongue, the snakeskin long coat, the rings shaped to suggest constriction. There are things that are predatory and patient and cold-blooded in the way that cold-blooded means something specific. The absence of the internal temperature regulation that warm-blooded animals maintain. The external dependence on environmental heat. Snakes are calculating hunters. They wait. They position. They commit to the strike only when the strike is already successful. This is Gideon's operational methodology expressed in the visual language of his appearance. He is also, in the way that all really effective horror antagonists are, genuinely frightening, not because of what he can do physically, but because of what he is willing to do intellectually. The monster that is going to overwhelm you with superior force is terrifying in a way that the body understands immediately and completely. The monster that is smarter than you, that has anticipated your responses, that has built a situation in which every move you make serves its purposes, whether you realize it or not, that operates through manipulation and design rather than raw power. That monster produces a different and in some ways more sustained kind of dread. You cannot fight your way past intelligence. You can only outthink it, and outthinking someone who has been thinking about this for decades while you just arrived is a steep climb. He was wrong about this too. Spectacularly, ironically wrong, in a way that the story will eventually make clear. And the wrongness will cost him everything. Gideon is not a simple villain. He is intelligent in ways that are genuinely impressive, and his ability to manage multiple complex variables simultaneously, to think several moves ahead in situations with many moving parts, reflects a kind of strategic competence that most antagonists in the series do not possess. He is also physically formidable in ways that go beyond what a man his age in a research career would be without assistance. He has been preparing his body for the confrontation he expects to eventually occur. The preparation involved surgery. He implanted within himself a modified Nemesis gamma parasite, a variant of the parasitic organism that powered the original Nemesis bioweapon, adapted to integrate with a host who retained cognitive function rather than simply amplifying aggression and combat capacity. The surgery was elective. He made that choice deliberately, accepting the physical changes it produced in his body, the gray and mottled skin tone, The slight elongation of his limbs, the subtle wrongness in his proportions that suggests something underneath the surface of him, is no longer arranged in quite the human configuration, as the acceptable cost of the capabilities the parasite granted. His strength is significantly beyond what his frame suggests. His speed is disconcertingly fast for someone who looks like an academic. And when the parasite is fully activated, when the circumstances of the story eventually push him past the threshold of controlled human form, what emerges is one of the most genuinely disturbing final confrontations the franchise has produced, but that is later. For now, Gideon is controlling the situation, or believes he is controlling the situation. He has Grace. He has access to the Ark. He has Zeno, the representative of the Connections, whose resources have been essential to his work, and whose investment in Elpis, though based on the same fundamental misunderstanding of its nature, provides the organizational backing that Gideon's individual resources could not sustain. He has everything he needs. He just needs to get to Raccoon City. Chapter 6. Leon Kennedy's Race Against Time. Raccoon City Revisited. Leon Kennedy has been to Raccoon City once before, or rather, he was in Raccoon City on the first day it became what it became, which was the same day that the city's brief period of horror and the city's structural existence effectively ended simultaneously. He was there for approximately 16 hours. He survived because of abilities, ease, and choices and a particular form of luck that he has spent 28 years being vaguely aware he does not fully deserve. He left the city in a military vehicle as a thermobaric missile turned the skyline behind him into fire. He has not been back since. The quarantine designation means officially nobody goes back. The psychological weight of what happened there means, unofficially, that most of the people who survived it have also chosen, quite deliberately, not to return. Leon is returning now, not by choice exactly, but in the specific way that choices shaped by years of accumulated obligation and personal stakes stop feeling optional. Grace is in a helicopter heading toward the ruins, with two men who intend to use her as a key to something that Sherry Birkin's investigation has identified as a potential global threat. Leon is the person positioned to stop that from happening. Therefore, Leon is going back to Raccoon City. Sherry handles logistics from a remote location, accessing systems and providing intelligence and coordinates, doing the work of a highly competent handler, while also managing the fact that her own symptoms have been progressing, and she has said nothing about it to anyone. She tells Leon she will keep helping regardless of the official orders she has received to stand down. She says this with the quiet firmness of someone who has already made the calculation and is not interested in having it argued with. She also tells him that a BSAA contingent from the North American branch, which has been operating with significant autonomy from the larger organization in recent years, has a presence in Raccoon City's eastern ruins. She does not know if they will be assets or complications. They are, as it turns out, complications, though not through any active malice. The BSAA squad is dead when Leon finds their camp, and the circumstances of their deaths tell a story about Zeno that is clarifying and alarming in equal measure. Zeno walked through that camp. Multiple trained tactical operators, combat-ready, armed, coordinated, are dead in ways that suggest the violence was entirely one-sided. Whatever Zeno is, whatever biological advantage he possesses, it is well past the level that standard military response can address. Leon finds footage on a dead agent's helmet camera, a figure moving through the camp, moving with the fluid, almost contemptuous ease that Albert Wesker used to move through combat situations, the same speed. The same quality of motion that exists slightly outside the range of what human reflexes can track. The same absolute confidence of someone who has internalized the fact that they are faster and stronger than anything they are likely to encounter. Leon knows that quality of movement. He has been on the receiving end of it in Spain and in Africa. He has a context for it that almost nobody else alive has. Chris Redfield has been sending information about Zeno, a detailed briefing that appears in Leon's documentation, connecting the figure in the footage to the available intelligence about who and what he might be. The briefing uses the word imitation deliberately, not clone, imitation. There is a distinction embedded in that word that becomes more significant later. Raccoon City in 2026 is a genuinely extraordinary environment, both as a physical space and as an emotional one. The ruins have been standing for 28 years, exposed to weather and time, and the slow work of biological reclamation that occurs in any sufficiently abandoned urban space. Vegetation has grown through the asphalt. Some buildings have collapsed. Others are still structurally intact, their interiors preserved by the relative dryness of the underground environment in ways that create a kind of accidental museum of late 1990s American urban architecture. The Raccoon City Police Department is still standing. Its distinctive art museum architecture, the ornate features and classical details that were always slightly incongruous for a police station in a mid-size American city, are still recognizable under 28 years of damage. The front gate is where Leon first barred it shut in 1998. The West Office still has the welcome banner that was misspelled on his first day. Jill Valentine's beret is still on her desk. Chris Redfield's jacket is still on the hook where he left it, with a file in the pocket. The small details of the police department, the material residue of a place that was briefly and catastrophically central to so many people's lives, are documented by the game with the care of someone who understands that these details carry weight beyond their individual significance. For Leon, walking back into the RPD is the kind of experience that does not have adequate language. He has been in combat situations that produce lasting psychological effects. He has done this work long enough to have developed the operational detachment that makes it possible to continue doing the work without being constantly overwhelmed by the accumulated weight of everything the work has involved. But operational detachment is a technique for managing the present. It has limited application when the present environment is the physical space where the past originally happened. The RPD is not just a building to Leon. It is the setting of the origin event, the specific architectural container of the night that determined everything that followed. He moves through it efficiently. He does not allow himself to stop. He uses the same locked-in professional focus that he uses for everything. But the focus is doing more work than usual in this building, and the effort of sustaining it against the material reality of the place is visible in every decision he makes. The game does something very specific with this RPD that rewards close attention. Every environment in the franchise's history carries some emotional weight. The Baker Estate and its particular quality of domestic horror, Castle Dimitrescu with its cold elegance, the Dolby Swamp with its oppressive, humid suffocation. But the RPD carries a different kind of weight because it is a real place in the history of the franchise in a way that other environments are not. It is not just a game level, it is the setting that defined the template for what Resident Evil became after the Spencer Mansion, the environment that introduced Leon and Claire, and the specific design philosophy of the second game. The place that demonstrated what the series could do when it fully committed to the experience of being completely, persistently, undeniably terrified. Walking back through it, 28 years later, through a version rendered with the full technical capability of an engine that was purpose-built for photorealistic horror, is a profoundly strange experience that operates simultaneously on multiple levels of awareness. There is the pure visual and environmental level, the way the ruins communicate time and damage, and the specific quality of abandonment in a building that was last fully occupied during a catastrophe. There is the nostalgic level, the recognition of architectural features and room layouts that have been part of the franchise's visual vocabulary for decades. And there is the emotional level, which for Leon is personal and rooted in specific memory rather than cultural association. Jill's beret is on the desk. Chris's jacket is on the hook. The welcome banner for Leon, misspelled welcome. On his first day and then corrected in a later game's version of the same building, is present here with both spellings acknowledged in an Easter egg that functions as the game talking to itself across time, across the different versions of this space that have accumulated in the franchise's history. The RPD in Requiem is all of those versions simultaneously. The original and the remakes and the memory and the ruin folded together into a single environment that means something specific to the people who have been with this series since the beginning, and means something different but equally significant to the people who are encountering these spaces for the first time. The Tyrant encounter in the ESD RPD is not the extended pursuit that the Mr. X encounter in the Resident Evil 2 remake provided. It is briefer and more explosive, a confrontation rather than a sustained stalking, designed to communicate what this space meant to the people who lived through it, rather than to replicate the exact experience. Leon knows how to deal with a tyrant. He has done it before. But the specific quality of fighting one in the main hall of the RPD, in the room where he has memory of specific people dying, produces something in him that pure combat competence cannot fully suppress. He kills it and moves on because that is what Leon Kennedy does. He kills what needs to be killed, he maintains the forward momentum that operational effectiveness requires, and he processes the weight of what that costs in whatever private space he has developed over 28 years of doing this kind of work. He is very good at this. He has had a lot of practice. The deeper ruins of Raccoon City beyond the RPD take the architectural familiarity of the police station and trade it for something raw. The outer districts of the city are less preserved. The thermobaric missile's blast radius produce differential effects depending on distance from impact and structural characteristics of individual buildings, and the outer districts have had 28 years of uninterrupted weather and biological reclamation to complete the work the strike started. Some streets are navigable, others are not, blocked by collapsed debris or by the organic overgrowth that has moved in from the surrounding countryside to claim space the human city no longer occupies. The city is becoming something else. Slowly, over decades, without anyone watching or directing the process, Raccoon City is becoming a ruin in the classical sense. Not a disaster site, but an archaeological site, the kind of place that future generations might regard the way we regard the cities buried by Vesuvius or consumed by jungle. Except those cities do not have whatever has been growing in their underground infrastructure for 28 years. They do not have Plant 43, expanded to a scale that turns entire underground corridors into the interior of a living organism, pulsing and reactive, and vastly different from the contained version that Umbrella managed in its underground laboratory in 1998. The plant has been growing in the dark and the damp and the absence of any suppression, feeding on the organic materials that filter down through the ruins above it, extending its root network through the city's underground infrastructure in ways that have thoroughly colonized the subterranean spaces between the surface ruins and the arc below them. Leon is fighting through the interior of something alive. The scale of it communicates time in a way that nothing else in the game does quite so directly. 28 years. That is what 28 years of unchecked biological growth looks like in a contained environment with sufficient nutrients. That is the physical expression of how long Raccoon City has been left alone. He gets through it. He reaches the Arc entrance. He goes through. Zeno is in the RPD when Leon arrives. The confrontation in the police station's east wing is not a fight in the conventional sense. It is an assessment. Zeno wants Leon to understand several things simultaneously: that he could kill him right now if he chose to, that he does not currently choose to, and that the reason he does not currently choose to has nothing to do with Leon's capacity for resistance. He summons a tyrant from deeper in the building to occupy Leon's attention while he moves Grace to the next location. The tyrant, a creature whose specific design is unmistakably connected to the ERPD's history, chases Leon through the ruins of his own professional origin story. Leon kills it. Of course he kills it. He is Leon Kennedy, and killing tyrants is, at this point, a competency he has developed across multiple decades and multiple incident types. But it costs him time and ammunition and physical reserves that are in shorter supply than they were this morning, and by the time he emerges from the RPD into the deeper ruins of Raccoon City, his condition has visibly deteriorated. Sherry finds the entrance to the Ark through Gideon's computer system and transmits the coordinates. The path there involves crossing a section of the ruins that has become, in the years since the strike, something of a biological reclamation project on a scale that no urban planner would have sanctioned. Plant 43, the mutated botanical organism that Umbrella developed in the Raccoon City underground labs, has been growing in the ruins since well before the missile strike destroyed the surface structures. In the absence of the fire suppression and containment systems that once constrained it, in the presence of 28 years of rain and organic debris filtering down through the rubble, it has achieved a scale that makes the version Leon encountered in 1998 look like a potted plant. The encounter with Plant 43 in the ruins of Raccoon City is the moment in Leon's section of the game where the scale of what the city became is most directly communicated. He is fighting a creature that has grown to occupy an entire district of underground infrastructure, moving through corridors wrapped in vines and biological matter, working around defensive responses that the organism has developed in the decades since it was last challenged, heading deeper into the dark toward a facility that was hidden so thoroughly that the missile strike that reduced the surface of the city to rubble did not damage it at all. Eventually, the Ark entrance appears. A door in the underground darkness, set into a reinforced wall, clean and functional in a way that nothing in the ruins around it is. A door that has been waiting, sealed and protected and patient, for the right moment to open. Leon goes through. Chapter 7. The Ark Facility. Secrets beneath the ruins, the Ark is Oswell Spencer's private laboratory. And it is everything that phrase implies about the psychology of a man who spent his adult life believing he had the right to pursue his vision of human evolution, regardless of the cost. It is well-funded. It is technologically sophisticated. It is designed with the aesthetic sensibility of someone who views scientific work as a form of high civilization, not just a professional activity, but an expression of what humanity at its finest is capable of achieving. The corridors are clean lines and good lighting and materials that communicate permanence and seriousness. It is nothing like the improvised, adaptive environments of Umbrella's corporate laboratories, the places where cost and expedience shaped every decision. Spencer built the Ark with his personal resources and designed it entirely according to his own preferences. The Ark is Oswell Spencer's private laboratory, and it is everything that phrase implies about the psychology of a man who spent his adult life believing he had the right to pursue his vision of human evolution, regardless of the cost. It is well-funded. It is technologically sophisticated. It is designed with the aesthetic sensibility of someone who views scientific work as a form of high civilization, not just a professional activity, but an expression of what humanity at its finest is capable of achieving. The corridors are clean lines and good lighting and materials that communicate permanence and seriousness. It is nothing like the improvised, adaptive environments of Umbrella's corporate laboratories, the places where cost and expedience shaped every decision. Spencer built the Ark with his personal resources and designed it entirely according to his own preferences. It sits beneath what was once the Raccoon City Orphanage District, and this location is not coincidental. The orphanage was where Spencer conducted his most personal research, the research that went beyond the institutional goals of Umbrella Corporation into the territory of his private obsessions. Umbrella's research programs were oriented around commercial applications, around the development of biological weapons that governments would pay for, and pharmaceutical compounds that the legitimate market would absorb. Spencer's contributions to those programs were significant and fundamental, but the research he conducted at the orphanage was different. It was organized around a question that was personal rather than commercial, whether consciousness, human identity, the specific pattern of memory and personality that makes a person who they are, could be transferred from one body to another. He began the orphanage experiments in the same general period when Project W was active, when he was selecting orphaned children as research subjects for the prototype virus program. The consciousness transfer research used different methods and pursued different goals, but the subject population overlapped. Children in institutional care, children without advocates, children whose absence from any normal social network meant that experiments conducted on them were unlikely to attract the attention or intervention of people with the standing to ask inconvenient questions. Spencer's journals from this period, fragments of which are accessible in the Ark's archive system, reveal someone whose moral architecture has been completely reorganized around the primacy of the project. He does not discuss the children as children in any emotional sense. He discusses them in the clinical register he brings to everything, as subjects with specific biological profiles, as data sources, as iterations in an experimental design. The suffering implied by the procedures documented in those journals is present in the record and utterly absent from his emotional response to it. The orphanage is gone by the time the game's events occur. It was destroyed in the same missile strike that destroyed everything else on the surface. The orphanage's basement level, the part directly above the Ark, was damaged but not destroyed, and players navigate through the ruins of those underground corridors in one of the game's most atmospheric sections. In a playable flashback sequence, accessible through a recording Grace discovers in the Ark's archive, players briefly experience the orphanage from the inside, from the perspective of one of the children who live there, a child who looks like Grace. The sequence is deliberately disorienting. You control someone small in a building designed for small people, with the knowledge that the children in this building were not being cared for in the conventional sense. The building has the surface features of institutional childhood care, dormitory rooms, and a common area, and the practical infrastructure of a place that houses people who need supervision and management. Underneath those surface features, detectable in the details if you look at them carefully, is the organizational logic of a research program rather than a residential program. You run back to a bed. You hide under it. You do not understand what is happening. The child does not understand what is happening. She is small and she is frightened. And the thing that frightens her is not fully visible, not fully comprehensible, even to the adults who are present and managing the situation around her. She is an experiment. She does not know she is an experiment. The distance between those two facts is the most disturbing space in the game. The playable orphanage sequence lasts only a few minutes. It does not provide explicit answers about what specific experiments were conducted there. It provides atmosphere, the specific quality of wrongness that permeates a place where the official purpose and the actual purpose diverge completely, and it provides the emotional context for understanding why Spencer, near the end of his life, called taking in an ordinary child as an act of atonement. He had seen what happened to the extraordinary children, the ones he made extraordinary through the machinery of his research programs. He chose a different path for Grace, an ordinary one. It was the only ordinary thing he did. It was built to hold Elpis. Everything else the Ark houses is secondary to that primary function. The research wings and storage facilities and the biological weapons repository exist in the service of the one thing that Spencer was working toward in the final years of his life, the thing he would not tell anyone about. The thing he built an entire underground facility to protect and preserve until the right person found it. The connections found the Ark before Grace did. Through surveillance of Spencer's estate in his final years, through the analysis of documents that filtered through various intelligence channels after his death, they identified the existence of the Ark without fully understanding its contents. What they knew was that it housed something Spencer had been working on toward the end of his life, something that he had described in fragmentary references as his final contribution, his last work. The connections assumed, based on their understanding of Spencer and the trajectory of Umbrella's work, that the last contribution of the man who had dedicated his life to developing ever more powerful biological agents would be an especially powerful biological agent. They were operating on an assumption that was entirely logical, given the available information. It was also entirely wrong. The connections sent Zeno to work with Gideon on the assumption that their complementary obsessions with Spencer's legacy would make them effective partners. Gideon's obsession was ideological, rooted in his worshipful relationship with Spencer's vision. Zeno's obsession was more mercenary, grounded in the connection's organizational interest in obtaining a weapon that could serve their specific geopolitical and commercial objectives. Two different motivations pointing toward the same locked door. The Ark's security system requires the correct genetic input to unlock the Elpis vault. Gideon's belief that Grace carries Spencer's transferred consciousness, embedded in her genetic profile through some mechanism that Spencer's incomplete notes implied but never fully described, makes her the presumptive key. Zeno shares this belief to a sufficient degree to have invested significant organizational resources in securing Grace's participation. Inside the Ark, Zeno reveals the scope of what he knows to Grace. He tells her about the orphanage experiments, the cloning program, the theoretical mechanism by which Spencer might have transferred his own consciousness into a succession of younger bodies as a form of extended life. He tells her she is the successful iteration of that program, the clone whose genetic architecture contains Spencer's memories and therefore the passcode to Elpis. He tells her all of this in the flat, confident tone of someone who believes they are presenting established facts rather than a theory built on incomplete information. He also tells her something else. Something that has been suspected but never confirmed about the history of the Raccoon City destruction incident. The missile strike was not the government's independent decision. The connections lobbied for it. Through their influence on the family, the organization that had tentacles reaching into the highest levels of government and intelligence, the connections ensured that the sterilization strategy was approved not primarily to contain the outbreak, but to bury Elpis, to prevent any other interested party from locating the Ark before the connections could. to turn the entire city into a destruction event so catastrophic that the search for specific items within it would be indefinitely delayed by the sheer scale of the wreckage. 100,000 people lived in Raccoon City. Most of them were dead before the missile struck, killed by the outbreak in the 72 hours between the first infection and the government's decision to end the situation from the air. But not all of them. The survivors in the evacuation corridors, the people who had gotten out of the inner city but had not yet cleared the perimeter when the strike was ordered, the people the official history has described as acceptable collateral damage in the necessary response to a civilian bioterrorist event. The connections did not care about any of that. The connections cared about Elpis. Everything else was overhead. Grace processes this information in the east wing of the Ark, while Gideon keeps Leon occupied in the exterior corridors, where the ruins of Raccoon City have been incorporated into the Ark's defensive systems in ways that suggest somebody has been maintaining a perimeter around this facilities even while it appeared sealed and abandoned. The archives wing of the Ark contains something that changes everything Grace thought she understood about her own history. Specifically, it contains a recording, AMO disc, the same format as the one her mother hid in room 204 of the Wrenwood Hotel, except this one was placed here by Spencer himself, and it contains the interview. The interview between Oswell Spencer and Alyssa Ashcroft, recorded in 2004, 2 years before Spencer's death. Grace puts the disc in the reader. The recording begins. Spencer is old in the recording, visibly diminished. The voice is still authoritative in the way that voices shaped by decades of certainty remain authoritative even as the physical instrument deteriorates. But the certainty has changed its nature. It is no longer the certainty of someone who believes he knows the right direction. It is the certainty of someone who has arrived at a destination and found it necessary to acknowledge what the journey cost. He talks about Umbrella, about the research he commissioned and oversaw, about the T virus and the G virus and the progenitor program, and the human testing and the decisions made in service of a vision of human evolution that he now, in the recording, characterizes with the word hubris. He does not wallow in self-reproach. He is not performing guilt for the recording's benefit. He is stating facts as he understands them from the vantage point of someone who has lived long enough to observe the full scope of his own consequences. Then he talks about Grace. He introduces Alyssa to Grace in the recording. He describes her as an orphan he has taken in, an ordinary child with no connection to Umbrella's research, no role in any experiment, no significance to the history of bioweapon development. He describes her as the most human thing he has allowed himself in decades. His blind hope, his atonement expressed in the form of protecting a child who has nothing to do with the catastrophes he set in motion. He calls the interview and everything he has said in it a requiem, a piece of music for the dead. Not a confession exactly, not an apology in the formal sense, but an acknowledgement, a statement made to someone who had earned the right to hear it through years of serious, sustained moral attention. And then he addresses Elpis. He mentions it by name. He says it is his final work. He says it is locked in the Ark, protected by a security system that can only be opened with the correct word. He calls it his blind hope, the same phrase he has just used to describe Grace. Grace, sitting in the Ark's archive room with the recording playing, and Leon somewhere in the facility, and Zeno and Gideon both oriented around her next action, understands two things simultaneously. The first thing she understands is that she is not a clone of Oswell Spencer. She is not the repository of transferred consciousness. She is exactly what Spencer said she was, an ordinary child he took in as an act of atonement. The elaborate theoretical structure that Gideon has spent years constructing, the ideological architecture that Zeno's organization has invested significant resources in supporting, is built on a foundation of misreading Spencer's incomplete notes. The second thing she understands is the password to the Ark's security system. Because her mother told her, in the hotel lobby, in the last seconds of her life, reaching for her daughter with a machete in her throat. Her mother called her my hope, just as Spencer called her his hope. The word he chose for both of them was the same word, because they were connected, because Alyssa was the person Spencer had trusted with Grace, because the password was always something rooted in personal rather than scientific significance. The password is hope. Chapter 8. Zeno and the Connections. The shadow behind the shadow. Before we get to what happens when Grace enters that password, we need to spend some time with Zeno, because Zeno is one of the most fascinating secondary antagonists the Resident Evil series has produced, and the game does not give him enough space to fully breathe, which is one of its few genuine narrative weaknesses. Understanding who and what he is makes everything in the arc section resonate differently. Zeno is a clone of Albert Wesker. This is not explicitly stated in the game's dialogue. It is strongly implied by a specific combination of his physical capabilities, his appearance, Gideon's contemptuous dismissal of him as nothing but an imitation, and the confirmation that his abilities derive from an NE gamma parasite, rather than from the prototype virus that empowered the original Wesker. He is not a lesser version of Albert Wesker. He is a different version, shaped by different experiences, operating under different constraints, carrying different memories and different damage. Albert Wesker died in 2009. He died in a volcano in Africa, killed by Chris Redfield and Sheba Alomar, killed by two of the individuals who had most directly stood between him and everything he was trying to accomplish across a career defined by the systematic subordination of every relationship and loyalty to the singular goal of his own apotheosis. He died exactly as he lived, absolutely convinced that he was correct, absolutely certain that his particular vision of human greatness was worth every price anyone had paid for it, completely untroubled by the accumulated evidence that the vision was a rationalization for pathology rather than a coherent philosophy. Umbrella had a program called Project W, which produced multiple individuals with the name Wesker. The program involved selecting orphaned children and using them as research subjects in the development of the prototype virus. And Albert Wesker was its most successful product in the specific sense that the virus activated in him and produced abilities that exceeded anything the program had managed before. But Project W produced at minimum a dozen other named Weskers, most of whom died before reaching anything like Albert's level of capability. At least one of them, Alex Wesker, survived long enough to develop a fully distinct identity and a plan for biological immortality of her own. Zeno is not one of those original Project W subjects. He was created later, using genetic material derived from Albert Wesker at some point between 1998 and 2009, developed by the Connections as an asset whose capabilities approximated Wesker's without being dependent on the specific conditions of the original prototype virus exposure. He has superhuman speed and strength and a degree of regenerative capacity, all derived from his NE gamma parasite rather than from direct viral enhancement. He is also infected with Raccoon City syndrome, the dark marks just barely visible on his face, a detail that raises interesting questions about when his genetic material was sourced and how much of it is authentically Wesker-derived versus something the process of cloning introduced. He is intelligent. He is ruthless in the specifically economic way of someone whose moral framework is organized entirely around resource acquisition and organizational advantage. He processes other people as assets or liabilities with a clinical efficiency that the original Wesker would probably recognize as a family resemblance, though he would also recognize it as a diminished version of his own, much more ideologically elaborate contempt for human limitation. His relationship with Gideon is purely functional and mutually exploitative. The Connections have resources and infrastructure that Gideon cannot access independently. Gideon has the scientific knowledge and the direct access to Spencer's research that the Connections need to locate and unlock Elpis. They are useful to each other up to the point where Elpis is secured, and both of them understand that past that point their interests diverge. The question is which of them acts first when that divergence becomes critical. The answer, it turns out, is Gideon, but we will get to that. What makes Zeno interesting beyond his role as the game's mid-tier antagonist is the specific way his existence comments on the Wesker legacy and on the broader franchise question of what happens to the ideology of a person like Wesker when the person is gone. Albert Wesker died. His vision did not. His vision, or something that passes for it, was so compelling to certain kinds of people, so organized and internally coherent and confident in its own framing, that versions of it have persisted in institutional and individual form for decades after his death. The Connections are one version of this persistence. They are not a Wesker organization in any direct genealogical sense. They predate his rise to prominence and operate on different principles. but they share with Wesker the fundamental premise that the existing structure of the world is a problem to be managed through the strategic application of superior force and intelligence, that the interests of ordinary people are irrelevant to the calculations of people with the capacity to shape larger outcomes, that accountability is a constraint for the weak rather than a universal obligation. It is the worldview of the apex predator, applied to organizational design rather than individual ambition. Xeno is the Connection's attempt to have an apex predator of their own. He has Wesker's physical capabilities, approximately, derived through a different mechanism that produces a slightly different profile but a recognizable family resemblance. He has Wesker's intellectual register, the cool superiority, the absolute confidence in his own analysis, the contempt for people he assesses as operating below his level. He has Wesker's aesthetic of controlled menace, the impeccable clothing, the economy of motion, the quality of someone for whom violence is not an escalation, but simply one of many available options selected on the basis of efficiency. What he does not have is Wesker's actual history, and that gap between the profile and the history, between the capabilities and the decades of specific experience that produce them, is where the imitation becomes visible. Wesker's cold certainty was built on a life of genuine exceptional capability, on the repeated confirmation that his assessment of his own superiority was borne out by outcomes. Xeno's cold certainty is a template, applied without the underlying experiential foundation. He is performing Wesker from the outside, rather than inhabiting the same psychology from the inside. This is why Gideon's dismissal of him as nothing but an imitation lands with such force when he finally says it out loud. Not because it is new information to Xeno, who almost certainly knows on some level, but because it is true in a way that goes past the simple genetic question of whether he is a clone. He is an imitation not just biologically, but existentially, a copy that has all the form and none of the specific accumulated weight of the original. The moment Xeno injects himself with Elpis, believing it will grant him additional power, and instead finds himself stripped of every biological modification, is the moment the imitation is fully exposed. The Wesker that Xeno has been embodying was always partly a performance, always partly a template, rather than an authentic expression. When the performance is stripped away, what remains is a person who has built their entire identity on being what they were designed to be, and now suddenly is not any of it. The expression on Xeno's face in that moment is the most vulnerable thing in the game. And Gideon kills him immediately, because Gideon is nothing if not efficient when vulnerability presents itself. The Connections, as an organization, represent a structural evolution in the Resident Evil universe's antagonist landscape. They are not a pharmaceutical company with a legitimate corporate face pursuing bioweapon development as a side business. They are not a religiously motivated cult conducting human experiments in an isolated community. They are not a government program operating under layers of institutional deniability. They are something newer, and in some ways more durable than any of those. A network of powerful actors in commerce, government, and intelligence, whose organizational coherence is maintained by shared access to information and shared vulnerability to that information being released. They caused the Raccoon City destruction. They have been managing the fallout from that decision for 28 years. They have been monitoring the development of every bioterrorism incident that followed, placing assets in various organizational positions, ensuring that the institutional memory of what Spencer built does not fully coalesce into the kind of public understanding that would produce meaningful accountability. They are, in a very real sense, the reason the story has reached this point, rather than having been resolved decades ago. Every time the long arc of the series' history has bent toward revelation, the Connections have been there bending it away from anything that would create significant consequences for them. Xeno's personality disorder, the specific quality of his narcissism that mirrors the original Wesker's God complex while being obviously derived from it rather than original, is one of the game's quieter ironies. He has all of Wesker's certainty in his own superiority, with none of Wesker's actual claim to that certainty. He is a copy that inherited the psychology of the original, without the fully realized capability that the psychology was built on. He knows this on some level. His consistent cold irritation when Gideon calls him an imitation suggests an awareness of the gap between what he believes himself to be and what he actually is. and a highly motivated refusal to examine that gap directly. The moment Zeno injects himself with Elpis is the moment everything he has believed about himself is stripped away. And it is done to him by the one thing that the original Wesker was always contemptuous of: by hope. By the acknowledgement that the damage done can be undone, that the body can be healed, that the modifications that made him feel exceptional and separate and above the ordinary condition of being human can be reversed not by force but by medicine. He expects transformation, he expects amplification, he gets cured, his enhanced abilities disappear. The physical modifications that gave him his speed and strength, the inherited legacy of the Xin Gamma parasite, are neutralized. He becomes, in the space of seconds, what Wesker always feared and always contemned: ordinary. Gideon kills him immediately. Chapter 9. Elpis. The last hope of a dying man, the vault opens. The password is hope, and it is correct, and the vault opens, and what is inside is not what anyone was expecting. There are several vials, small, carefully sealed, labeled with clinical precision in a font that belongs to a different era of pharmaceutical documentation. The careful, meticulous labeling practices of a scientist who understood that the notation had to be clear enough to communicate without being specific enough to compromise. The vials contain a compound that looks unremarkable in the containers, a slightly amber liquid that could be any number of things, and announces nothing about its nature through visual inspection. The documentation accompanying the vials is more revealing. Spencer left detailed research notes in the ARC's archive system, accessible once the vault is opened, and the notes describe something that takes Grace several minutes of reading to fully process because it contradicts everything that every interested party has assumed about Elpis since the first reference to it appeared in Spencer's fragmentary papers. Elpis is not a weapon, it is an antiviral. A comprehensive, potent, broadly applicable antiviral agent derived from the progenitor virus itself, engineered using the same deep understanding of that organism's biology that Spencer spent his life developing, but directed at a fundamentally different goal. Rather than exploiting the progenitor's capacity for cellular restructuring to create mutagenic agents, Spencer used it to develop a compound that identifies and neutralizes progenitor-derived viral agents within an infected host's system. Every bioweapon umbrella ever created, every virus in the T-virus lineage, every G-virus derivative, every organism that traces its origin back to the progenitor virus is susceptible to Elpis. In a single compound, Spencer had created an antidote to his life's work. The notes are written in the voice of someone who has done the accounting and found the result intolerable. Spencer catalogs, with the same clinical precision that characterized all his scientific documentation, what his research actually produced. Not the directed evolution of humanity towards some higher form, not the transcendence of biological limitation. What it actually produced was Raccoon City. What it actually produced was every infected person and every mutated body and every ruined community and every family destroyed by biological weapons that existed solely because one man with resources and vision and absolutely no effective external constraint decided that his particular framework for human progress justified pursuing it regardless of who it hurt. He did not stop believing in the framework. The notes do not read like a conversion experience, like someone who has suddenly seen the error of their premises. Spencer is not renouncing the idea that humanity could be biologically directed towards something better. He is acknowledging that his methods produced outcomes that are not justifiable even within that framework, that the damage done by what he built is real and lasting in ways that no philosophical ambition can excuse, and that the only proportionate response is to create the means of undoing as much of that damage as can be undone. There is a specific quality of moral reckoning in Spencer's notes that is worth examining carefully because it is neither the full redemption that would make him sympathetically tragic nor the continued unrepentant evil that would make him simply monstrous. It is something more uncomfortable and ultimately more true to how very powerful people who have caused enormous harm tend to actually process that harm. He acknowledges the damage. He does not fully acknowledge himself as the source of it. There is still, embedded in the clinical detachment of his documentation, the slight remove of a man who views his own history as a force that moved through him rather than decisions he made. The passive construction of someone who allowed terrible things to happen rather than someone who built the infrastructure that made them happen. This is what survivors of people like Spencer have always known, what the series has been building toward for 3 decades. The people at the top of the institutional structures that produce catastrophes rarely experience themselves as having done anything wrong in any complete sense. They experience themselves as having pursued legitimate goals with imperfect tools, as having operated within the constraints of their context, as having made choices that were rationally defensible given the information available at the time. The gap between that self-understanding and the reality of what their choices actually produced is enormous, and most of them never fully cross it. Spencer crossed it far enough to build Elpis. He did not cross it far enough to turn himself in, to stand trial, to accept the accountability that 28 years of survivors deserved. He died in his private residence, killed by the most direct product of his own arrogance, and the last useful thing he did was hide an antiviral in a basement and arrange for the right person to find it. It is not enough. It was never going to be enough. The game does not present it as enough. But it is something, and in the specific register of Resident Evil's moral universe, where the line between something and nothing is often drawn in blood, something matters. Elpis is the means. It cannot restore the dead. It cannot rebuild Raccoon City. It cannot undo the Baker family or the Baker estate or any of the specific catastrophes that specific weapons derived from Spencer's research created in specific lives. But it can stop the progression of Raccoon City syndrome in the survivors who are dying slowly from the dormant virus that infected them 28 years ago. It can neutralize active T virus infections. It can cure the people in the biological weapons repository on level B4 of the Ark, whose bodies have been mutated by Gideon's experiments. It can, in the hands of the right people with the right resources, begin the process of systematic antiviral response to the category of threats that Spencer's research created. The implications extend further than immediate cures. If Elpis works as Spencer designed it, if the antiviral properties documented in his notes are as comprehensive as they appear, then every bioweapon in the T-virus lineage, every organism that the progenitor virus touched in its decades of weaponized development potentially has a counter. The deterrent value that Gideon correctly identifies as supporting the existing balance of power in the bioweapons space, the threat of infection that has hung over every incident in the series' history, the thing that makes the stakes feel real rather than abstract, has an answer. This does not make those weapons less dangerous in the immediate term. A bioweapon that can theoretically be cured with an antiviral that does not yet exist in large quantities is still an extremely dangerous bioweapon in the specific incident where the antiviral is unavailable. The production and distribution of Elpis in sufficient quantities to constitute a meaningful global medical response to progenitor-based agents is an enormously complex logistical and political challenge that will require exactly the kind of institutional cooperation and governmental transparency that the connections have spent decades preventing. But the possibility exists. Before the R-key, before Grace found what Spencer left, the possibility did not exist. That is the specific value of what Spencer built. Not a solution, but the opening of a solution space. Not hope in the sense of certainty, but hope in the sense that Grace's name carries. Blind hope. The hope that plants something without being able to see where it grows. He called it his blind hope because he could not see how it would be used, or who would use it, or whether the people who found it would understand what it was. He designed the security system around Grace, not because of cloning experiments or consciousness transfers, but because he wanted it found by someone who had no connection to the institutional frameworks that had produced the disasters. Someone clean of that specific contamination. Someone whose motivation for using what they found would be personal and human rather than organizational and strategic. He chose Alyssa Ashcroft to raise Grace because Alyssa had spent her professional life doing the exact kind of work that Spencer's network had tried to suppress, documenting the truth, insisting on accountability, refusing to let the institutional weight of the organizations that had caused harm use that same institutional weight to avoid the consequences of the harm. He knew Alyssa's history. He had read everything she had written. He chose her because of everything she was, and then he placed Grace in her care as both a gift and a trust. He called the interview a requiem for those who have passed. He was composing the music for his own death as much as for anyone else's. The word hope was the password because it was what he called Grace. And Alyssa called Grace her hope in the last seconds of her life, in the hotel lobby, reaching for her daughter. The password was always going to be found by Grace because Grace was always going to be the person who found it. Spencer's design, the last design of his life, was built around that inevitability. Grace uses Elpis on Leon. She finds him collapsed at the entrance to Pandora, the Ark's biological weapons repository, his symptoms having accelerated past the point where he can sustain independent movement. She injects him. The antiviral works with a speed that reflects the sophistication of Spencer's engineering, targeting the virus in his bloodstream, with the precision of something that understands exactly what it is attacking. The dark marks on his hand, on his neck, spreading toward his collarbone, begin to fade. The fever breaks, his eyes clear. Leon sits up in the ruins of Umbrella's last secret laboratory and feels, for the first time in months, like himself. Then Gideon returns. Chapter 10. The Final Confrontation. Nemesis Reborn. Gideon did not die when Leon apparently killed him in the Ark's defensive corridors. This should not surprise anyone familiar with the Resident Evil series' approach to antagonists whose narrative significance demands a final confrontation. But the manner of his return is something the game earns, rather than simply invoking. He was not playing dead, he was healing. The NEE gamma parasite that he surgically implanted into himself has a regenerative component that Leon's weapons, precise and devastating as they are, were not quite sufficient to push past. He heard everything. He was healing in a corridor adjacent to the chamber, where Grace played the recording, where the truth of Elpis was revealed, where the compound that he had spent years pursuing and misidentifying was opened and administered. He heard Grace realize his entire theoretical framework was wrong. He heard Zeno learn that Elpis was an antiviral. He heard the sound of the compound working on Leon, the sound of the specific thing Gideon had believed was Spencer's great offensive weapon being used as a curative. What he does with this knowledge is not what a person operating within a conventional moral framework would do with it. A person operating within a conventional moral framework, confronted with evidence that they have been catastrophically wrong about the central premise of their life's work, experiences something. Grief, perhaps. Disorientation. The specific quality of psychic disruption that comes from having a foundational belief collapse. There is usually a period of processing, however brief, in which the implications of the wrongness are registered and integrated. Gideon does not have a period of processing. He registers the information, evaluates its implications within his existing framework, and arrives at a new conclusion that his existing framework is capable of accommodating. The conclusion is this: an antiviral agent capable of neutralizing all progenitor-derived biological weapons is, if anything, more dangerous to the existing world order than the mind control virus he believed Elpis to be. Because the existing world order is built in significant part on the deterrent value of biological weapons as geopolitical instruments. The mutual assured destruction logic that has shaped military and diplomatic relationships for decades incorporates bioweapons as a category of existential threat. Remove that category entirely, cure the weapons at the molecular level, and you destabilize the deterrent structure in ways that could produce catastrophic instability. This is not, by most evaluations, a compelling argument for suppressing a cure for diseases that are currently killing the survivors of a civilian disaster. It is the kind of argument that sounds structural and consequential if you are already motivated to maintain a world where the things you have built retain their value. And it is the kind of argument that reveals, without meaning to, the speaker's actual investment in preserving the status quo rather than any genuine concern for geopolitical stability. Gideon has spent his life building on Spencer's foundations. If Elpis negates those foundations, if the antiviral works as documented and systematically neutralizes every progenitor-derived pathogen, then the infrastructure Gideon has maintained and expanded and devoted himself to is rendered obsolete. He is not going to allow that. He has come too far and given too much and made choices that are not reversible for the outcome to be this. He kills Zeno first. Growing the tentacle from the arm where the NE gamma parasite has been most densely integrated, the physical expression of the organism he introduced into himself as a voluntary enhancement, and using it with precision and without ceremony. Zeno, stripped of his abilities by the Elpis he injected believing it would make him stronger, cannot avoid it. His head separates from his body. He goes down quickly and without theatrical delay. Then Gideon addresses Grace and Leon with the specific register of someone who has made all their important decisions and is now simply executing them. Leon is restored. The Elpis worked. He is upright and functional, and all of his considerable operational capacity is available to him in a way it has not been for months. He is also holding the Requiem, the gun he gave Grace in the Rhodes Hill Care Center and that she has carried through everything that has happened since then, returned to him in the moment before the final confrontation, because Grace understands that what is about to happen requires the specific competencies that Leon has, and she does not. The Requiem. The word means a mass for the dead. It is also the name Spencer gave to the interview he granted Alyssa. It is also the name of the game. All three uses of the word converge here, in the arc, at the end. The fight with Gideon moves through two phases that mirror the design of the Nemesis encounters that older fans will remember from Resident Evil 3. The first phase is Gideon still in something resembling human form, using the tentacle extensions of his parasite integration as weapons, coordinating multiple attacks simultaneously, pulling the electrical infrastructure of the Ark's power grid into his offense through the electromagnetic sensitivity the parasite has developed in his nervous system. He is extremely dangerous in this phase, and he is not interested in conversation. He has said what he needed to say. The second phase is the moment Leon's damage accumulates past the threshold that the NEE gamma parasite can accommodate while maintaining human form. The parasite is designed to amplify the host's capabilities in response to extreme physical stress. Past a certain threshold of damage, the amplification stops being selective and becomes total. Everything in Gideon's body that was still organized around the maintenance of human appearance and human proportion is repurposed toward one thing: continuation. The parasite expands. It takes the architecture of his body and rebuilds it according to its own logic rather than his. What remains is not Victor Gideon anymore, in any meaningful sense. It is the parasite wearing the material of Victor Gideon, a massive, multi-limbed, barely coherent expression of the NE-gamma organism's full biological potential, filling the chamber with organic mass and moving with the kind of purpose that is not organized thought, but is not entirely without tactical awareness either. It is an apex expression of the research that Umbrella conducted into controlled biological terror, the Nemesis program taken to its logical limit in a host that was willing. Leon kills it. He uses the Requiem to do it. The gun that Grace carried through the care center and Raccoon City and the Ark, the gun that Leon gave her because he assessed that she needed it more than he needed it at that particular moment, the gun that bears the same name as Spencer's final act of conscience, fired by the man who came back to the city that made him in order to prevent the last of Spencer's enemies from destroying the last of Spencer's hope. The Ark begins its self-destruct sequence. Gideon activated it in his final coherent moments, the last option available to someone who cannot have the outcome he wanted and has therefore decided that no outcome is preferable. The facility is going to come down. Chapter 11. Endings, Aftermath, and What Comes Next. Leon and Grace lie in the dark in the Ark's central chamber, with the facility collapsing around them in stages, and no obvious exit that either of them currently has the physical capacity to reach. It is the specific kind of moment that the Resident Evil series has produced many times across its history. The quiet after the crisis, the space between the end of the immediate emergency and the knowledge of what comes next, filled with the specific weight of everything that just happened. Grace thinks about her mother. She thinks about the interview on the disc, about Spencer calling the child he was entrusting to Alyssa his blind hope, about the word he chose and the word her mother chose in the last seconds of her life, and how those two words are the same word and form a line across the years between them that runs directly through the thing Grace just did in the vault. She thinks about what she inherited without knowing she was inheriting it. The journalist's daughter carrying the journalist's instinct for the truth, regardless of what finding it costs. The child of a woman who refused to be silenced, carrying the silence forward as a choice rather than an imposition. Leon thinks about Raccoon City. He thinks about the RPD and the banners, and Marvin Branage dying in the main hall, and all the people in that building who did not survive that night. He thinks about what it means to have spent 28 years being defined, in some essential way, by a single evening in a police station in a city that no longer exists. He thinks about the virus that has been dying in his blood since Grace administered the Elpis, about what it means to have carried that for so long without knowing you were carrying it. Light comes from above. Soldiers come through the gap in the ceiling, fast roping into the chamber with the fluid efficiency of a highly trained tactical unit. Hound Wolf Squad. Chris Redfield's people, dispatched by Chris Redfield, who is noted by Leon's remark to be characteristically late to the resolution of situations that Chris technically initiated by sending Leon in the first place. The Hound Wolf operators secure the area, establish a perimeter, and begin extraction. Grace and Leon are brought up into the ruins of Raccoon City under a sky that is gray and clouded, but present, actually present, after hours in the underground dark. In a helicopter somewhere above the ruins, Grace calls Sherry. The Elpis works on Sherry too. The black marks fade. She sounds like herself again. The scandal breaks within days. The existence of the Ark, the revelation of a hidden umbrella laboratory beneath the quarantined ruins of Raccoon City, the documentation of the Connection's role in lobbying for the sterilization strategy, the evidence that the destruction of Raccoon City was arranged at least partly to protect a corporate secret, rather than purely to contain a biological threat. All of it goes public, in a wave of reporting that generates the kind of institutional inquiry that the series has been pointing toward since Raccoon City's destruction was first framed as a government secret. The United States president denies involvement. Of course the president denies involvement. But the documents are specific, and the connections are traceable, and the denials, however performative, exist in a public record that can now be addressed. Emily is found alive. Leon was right. He had aimed carefully, and Emily's vital organs are intact, and the Elpis that Grace administered to her mutated form reverses the biological changes that Gideon's experiments had embedded in her cellular structure. Her eyesight returns. She is, for the first time in her documented existence, in a body that belongs fully to her rather than to someone else's experimental design. Grace adopts her. In the mid-credit sequence, Grace is at her FBI desk. Framed on the wall behind her is a photograph of herself with Alyssa. Framed beside it is a photograph of herself with Emily. She is on a call with Leon, who is characteristically informal and slightly oblique about important things, and they talk about nothing and everything in the way that two people who have been through something significant together sometimes talk in the aftermath. Leon mentions that Chris is somewhere looking for something, which is as specific as Leon is going to be about classified operations over an unsecured line. Grace says she hopes he finds it. Then the credits roll, and if you stay through the credits, which you should, you get the scene. In the ruins of the Ark's lower levels, where the collapse has not been total, where sections of the facility are damaged but navigable, a group of soldiers moves with practiced efficiency. They are wearing tactical gear that is not marked with any insignia. Their radio communication uses terminology that encodes their allegiance without stating it, and the encoding is familiar to anyone who has been paying attention to the Connection's operational language throughout the game. One of them radios back. The Hound Wolf Squad has been neutralized from the area. The objective is recoverable. They are moving to retrieve it before the wolves return. What the objective is, the game does not say. The Ark held Elpis, which has been distributed and is no longer in the facility, but the Ark held other things, years of Spencer's research, documents and biological samples, and the technical foundation of decades of work in the most sophisticated private research laboratory ever built by a man who had effectively unlimited personal resources and the specific genius for bioweapon development that defined his entire professional life. Not everything was destroyed in the collapse. Not everything was accounted for in Grace's report. The connections are still operational. Zeno is dead. Their organizational connection to Gideon's specific project is severed. But organizations like the Connections do not cease to exist when a project fails and a representative dies. They recalibrate. They identify new objectives. They apply whatever institutional memory survived the loss. And somewhere in the collapsed architecture of the Ark, they have identified an objective worth retrieving before the people who just destroyed their operation have the chance to secure it first. The screen goes dark. Chapter 12. The Deeper Story. What Requiem is really about, everything we have discussed so far, is what happens in Resident Evil Requiem. The events, the characters, the specific sequence of choices and discoveries and confrontations that constitute the game's plot. But understanding what the game is really doing requires stepping back from the narrative mechanics and looking at what the story is built around thematically, what the writers were trying to work out in the space between the bioweapons and the boss fights and the running through darkened hospitals. Requiem is a story about inheritance, not inheritance in the legal or financial sense, though that is present too. Inheritance in the sense of what people carry forward from the generations before them without being asked whether they want to carry it. Grace inherits her mother's refusal to stop asking questions, her mother's instinct that the truth is worth pursuing past the point where it is comfortable or safe to keep pursuing. She also inherits, without knowing it, the trust that Oswell Spencer placed in Alyssa, the specific weight of being the person someone chose to represent their final act of conscience. She carries both of those things without being aware of them for most of the game, and the moment she understands both simultaneously is the moment she knows what to do. Leon inherits Raccoon City, not in any abstract sense, but in the very direct biological sense that the city is living inside him, that the event that defined his professional identity also introduced into his body something that has been quietly waiting to kill him ever since. His inheritance from that night is not just psychological, it is molecular, and the elpis that cures him, the antiviral engineered by the man who ultimately was responsible for Raccoon City in the first place, and is itself a form of inheritance moving in the other direction. Spencer's last act leaving something to the people his first acts damaged. The comparison between Grace and Leon is one of the game's most intelligently constructed elements. They are both dealing with inherited weight, but the nature of that inheritance is opposite in its orientation. Leon's inheritance from the past is killing him from the inside, a slow, biological reclamation of the life he built on the foundations of the night that defined him. Grace's inheritance from the past is the thing that makes her capable of addressing the present, her mother's determination and Spencer's blind hope, combining in a person who was never supposed to be significant to the history of bioweapon research, who wandered into that history through the accident of parentage, and who turns out to be exactly the person required. The game is also, very deliberately, a story about what fear actually looks like versus what competence looks like. This is primarily expressed through the contrast between Grace and Leon as playable characters, and it is one of the most thoughtful design decisions the franchise has made in years. Grace is scared constantly. Every moment of her arc involves active management of fear that would, in a conventional action game, be presented as weakness or as something to be overcome once and left behind. She does not leave it behind. She is still scared when she walks into the vault. She is scared when she punches in the password. Fear is not the thing that needs to be defeated. Fear is just the atmosphere in which everything else happens, and competence is the ability to function within that atmosphere rather than the absence of needing to function in it. Leon, by contrast, has completed most of the arc that Grace is in the middle of. He has been afraid in Raccoon City, and in Spain, and in Africa, and in every incident in between. And through 28 years of facing that fear without flinching, he has developed the specific quality of calm that sustained operational experience produces. He is not fearless, he is post-fear, in the specific sense that people who have been afraid enough times, in enough consequential situations, eventually arrive at. He has seen the worst of what the world can produce at a biological level, multiple times. He is still here. That knowledge does not eliminate the fear response, but it contextualizes it in a way that prevents it from being the dominant factor in his decision-making. The two approaches to fear are not presented as a hierarchy with one better than the other. Grace's anxious intelligence and Leon's experienced calm are both necessary to the resolution of what happens in the arc. She has the analytical capacity to understand what Elpis actually is. He has the physical capability to deal with Gideon's final form. They cannot do each other's portion of the work, and neither of them can do the whole thing alone. This is a cleaner expression of the franchise's dual protagonist tradition than most previous iterations have managed. The Revelations games, the first and second, use dual protagonists to provide tonal contrast and gameplay variety without always making the case that both characters were genuinely necessary to the story. Requiem makes that case clearly and specifically. Grace is not Leon in a horror wrapper. Leon is not Grace in an action wrapper. They are functionally distinct people with functionally distinct roles in the same story, and understanding both of them requires spending real time in both of their perspectives. Emily inherits suffering that was never hers. She was created to be used. She was blinded by procedures she did not consent to because she was not capable of consent. She lived her entire existence in a glass room in a medical facility, knowing nothing outside it, experiencing the world through hearing and through the rare kindness of staff members like Jeff Gray, who saw a child rather than a research designation. What she inherits from Grace in the mid-credits moment that gives the story its emotional resolution is something she was never supposed to have: a mother, a home, continuity with a future that belongs to her rather than to someone else's project. The franchise inheritance angle runs through everything too. Requiem is built on 30 years of accumulated Resident Evil lore, 30 years of antagonists and viruses and organizations and survivors, and it brings a significant portion of that inheritance into direct contact with itself, in ways that feel earned rather than convenient. The Raccoon City survivors are dying from the event that started everything. The character who most embodied the series' central antagonist philosophy turned out to be not the final villain, but the organizing principle around which multiple other villains oriented themselves. Spencer, the original source of the franchise's structural horror, turns out to have done one thing right at the end, and that one thing right retroactively changes the moral weight of everything that preceded it without excusing any of it. The title, Requiem, carries all of this. A requiem is music for the dead. Spencer called his final interview a requiem. He was composing something for the people Umbrella killed, for the 100,000 people of Raccoon City, for the Baker family in Louisiana, for every body and every ruined life that the research he commissioned produced. He could not bring them back. He could not undo the specific harm done to specific people, but he could do one thing, and he did it, and he arranged for the right person to find it. Grace Ashcroft is the daughter of the woman who made Spencer tell the truth. She is also the person Spencer designated to release the cure. She inherited both of those roles from people who loved her in their own specific and complicated ways, and she discharged them both in the same moment, in the arc, entering a single word. It is not a triumphant ending in the conventional sense. The connections are still out there, moving through the wreckage, retrieving their objective. The political mechanisms that allowed Raccoon City to happen, the family, and the layers of government complicity, and the intelligence infrastructure that has been managing the suppression of bioweapon accountability for 30 years are still in place. The world after Requiem knows more than it knew before. It is not safe. It is not resolved. But it knows more, and it has an antiviral agent that opens possibilities that were previously unavailable. There is also a generational dimension to the ending that the franchise has not fully explored before. Alyssa Ashcroft survived Raccoon City and spent her adult life fighting the legacy of what happened there. She died for that fight, killed by the institutional machinery that she never stopped challenging. Her daughter Grace was raised without knowing any of this and then walked directly into the middle of it and completed what her mother was reaching toward when she hid that disc in room 204. The pattern between them, the journalist mother who told the truth, regardless of cost, passing to the analytical daughter who found the truth when it needed to be found, is a story about how certain kinds of courage persist across generations, even when the specific knowledge that produced that courage is not explicitly transmitted. Alyssa did not tell Grace about Spencer, or about Elpis, or about the connections. She could not. She died before she had the chance. But she raised a daughter who went looking for the truth anyway, who could not leave the Wrenwood Hotel without understanding what happened there, who followed the investigation wherever it went regardless of the danger of following it. She taught that without knowing she was teaching it, and Grace learned it without knowing she was learning it. And in the arc, at the password terminal, with the weight of everything her inheritance asked of her resting on a single word, she remembered that her mother had called her hope. Hope, Spencer called it. Blind hope. Not the hope of someone who can see the outcome clearly and knows it will be good. The hope of someone who plants something in the ground without knowing what season will find it, trusting that the right person, in the right moment, will know what to do. Grace knew what to do. Epilogue, What is left behind? There are questions that Requiem deliberately leaves unanswered, and understanding which questions those are and why they remain open is part of understanding what the game is pointing toward next. The most immediately obvious unanswered question is the identity of the Connection's objective in the arc. The post-credits scene establishes clearly that something in the facility was worth sending a tactical team to recover after the main events concluded, something significant enough to move on before the Hound Wolf Squad could secure the area. The nature of that objective is not revealed, but the arc's contents were extensive, and Spencer's research encompassed things beyond Elpis. A laboratory that spent years as the private research space of one of bioweapon development's foundational figures, operated in complete secrecy and outside any institutional oversight, would contain research threads that nobody has yet followed to their conclusions. The Connection's post-credits dialogue references neutralizing the remaining BSAA forces and retrieving the objective before the wolves arrive. The framing suggests urgency in a specific target rather than a general salvage operation. They were not there to see what was in the arc. They knew what they were looking for. Whatever the objective is, it was already identified before the events of Requiem concluded, which means either their intelligence network maintained awareness of ARC's contents beyond what Zeno communicated to Grace and Leon, or the objective is not something that the main story revealed at all. The second major thread involves the nature of Hunk's appearance in the arc. The commander who confronts Leon in the biological weapons depot, who fights with the regenerative capability that suggests biological enhancement, who carries himself with the specific quality of lethal professional indifference that Umbrella's elite operators developed in the organization's operational years, has been data mined to carry the character designation Old Hunk. If this is Hunk, the legendary Umbrella operative who has survived every mission in franchise history through a combination of exceptional skill and something that is always read as more than coincidence, then his presence in the arc raises questions that the game does not answer. Whose side is he on? What was his role in the arc's decades of apparent dormancy? What did he know about Elpis before anyone else arrived? Hunk has always been one of the franchise's most deliberate mysteries, a figure who exists at the edge of every major event, never fully explained, whose loyalty appears to be to himself and to professional excellence rather than to any organization. If the Connections have somehow secured his services, or if he has been operating independently in the arc's vicinity for reasons of his own, the implications for subsequent stories are significant. The question of Chris Redfield is pointed rather than incidental. He dispatched the Hound Wolf Squad to rescue Leon and Grace. He is clearly aware of the events in Raccoon City. He did not come himself, and Leon's comment about him suggests a certain residual exasperation at Chris's habit of being somewhere else during the resolution of crises that his intelligence generated. The post-credit scene's reference to the wolves as the timer against which the Connection's operative is racing suggests that Chris is in the picture, that the Hound Wolf Squad is still active in the area, and that whatever the objective is, it will be contested. The series' future, implied by everything that Requiem sets up, involves the Connections as its primary antagonist structure. Umbrella is finished, confirmed dead by the events of Requiem. The company's history now a matter of public record in ways that prevent any institutional resurrection. The physical remnants of Umbrella's research are now contested territory between the Connections, who want to use them for their own purposes, and the BSAA's increasingly autonomous Hound Wolf Squad, and whatever governmental structures prove capable of maintaining accountability rather than simply managing appearances. There is also the matter of what Elpis does to the franchise's established threat landscape. If the antiviral is produced and distributed at scale, if the progenitor-derived bioweapons that have provided the series with its core horror for 30 years suddenly have a comprehensive counter, then the stories that come next cannot be organized around the same category of threat. The series will need to find its monsters somewhere new. The Connections represent one direction, the political and organizational horror of institutional power operating without accountability, the machinery of suppression and manipulation that does not require viral agents to be dangerous. Hunk, and whatever he represents, are another direction. And the arc's unrevealed objective is potentially a third, a new weapon or a new organism or a new piece of Spencer's research that opens a threat vector that the Elpis antiviral does not address. Requiem does not close the franchise, It closes a chapter that has been building since 1998, the chapter organized around Raccoon City as wound and the T-virus as the specific biological expression of Umbrella's moral failure. It does so with the care and the weight that 30 years of accumulated story deserved, and then it opens the next chapter's door and shows you the darkness waiting on the other side. That darkness does not have a name yet. We will find out together. Grace Ashcroft is somewhere in that future. Whether she returns to an active role, or whether her story concluded with the discovery of Elpis and the adoption of Emily remains to be seen. But the world she has shaped by finding Elpis is meaningfully different from the world that existed before she walked into the Wrenwood Hotel on October 8, 2026. Leon Kennedy is somewhere in that future, cured of the virus that has been killing him, carrying the weight and the experience and the particular deeply embedded competence of a man who has been doing this kind of work since he was 21 years old. He has been to Raccoon City and come back out of it on the other side, not just of the city, but of the specific biological inheritance the city left inside him. He can close a chapter in a way that he could not close it before. Sherry Birkin is cured. The G-virus antibodies she has carried since childhood, the biological legacy of her father's catastrophic failure and her own unlikely survival, were never removed by Elpis. Elpis addresses T-virus lineage agents. Sherry's relationship to the G-virus is older and more complicated, and is not addressed by the antiviral, but the Raccoon City syndrome is gone. The death sentence is lifted. Whatever she does next, she does it with that particular weight removed from the equation. Emily is cured. Emily is with Grace. Emily is, for the first time in her existence, something other than a research designation and a biological key and a failed copy of someone else. She is a child who has a mother and a home, and the specific ordinary future that Grace's own childhood contained before everything complicated. She is, in a very real sense, the thing Spencer said Grace was when he handed her to Alyssa in that recorded interview. She is hope in its most direct and personal form. Raccoon City still stands in its ruins. The quarantine will likely remain. The ruins will continue their slow process of biological reclamation. The memories will continue to live in the people who carry them, but the secrets are out. The truth is documented. The long suppression that the connections maintained over the full story of what happened there and why has been broken, not completely, not irreversibly, but substantially enough that the next effort to suppress it will require more work, and will be more visible, and will be done against the background of a public record that now contains things it did not contain before. A woman walked into a hotel where her mother died and came out the other side with the last hope of the man who started everything. She did not know that was what she was doing when she agreed to go. She was just trying to understand how her mother died. It turns out those two things were always going to be the same investigation. That is the full story of Resident Evil Requiem. Every thread, every character, every piece of lore that the game builds across its 20 or so hours of story, laid out slowly, in the dark, the way these stories deserve to be received. What Capcom has built with this game is not just a conclusion to the T-virus era, though it functions as that. It is a meditation on what it means to live under the weight of something you did not cause, what it means to carry damage that was inflicted on you by systems and decisions made by people who never knew your name, what it means to be young and frightened and analytically gifted and suddenly standing at the center of 30 years of accumulated consequences that have been circling toward you since before you were born. Grace did not ask for any of this, neither did Leon, neither did Sherry, neither did Emily. None of the people at the center of Requiem's story chose their circumstances. They chose their responses to those circumstances, and those responses are what the story is actually about. The virus, the facility, the megalomaniacal villain, the conspiracy that reaches into the government, those are the architecture. The actual substance of the story is the specific quality of decision-making that happens when ordinary people, or people who have become extraordinary through sustained exposure to impossible situations, are confronted with choices that matter in ways that most decisions never do. Grace entered a password. It was the right password, and everything changed. That is, ultimately, the simplest possible summary of what Requiem is. A story about a woman who found the right word at the right moment because she came from the right people and paid the right kind of attention. Everything else, the 20 hours of gameplay and the decades of franchise history, and the elaborate institutional architecture of Umbrella, and the connections and the arc, was in service of that moment. If you made it this far, then you are either deeply invested in this franchise, or it is very late where you are, and you have been letting this play in the dark while the world got quiet around you. Either way, I am genuinely glad you are here. If this kind of deep, slow storytelling is something you enjoy, the best thing you can do is subscribe and drop a comment below, letting me know what you thought. Tell me what surprised you. Tell me what detail you had missed. Tell me what question Requiem left you with that you are most hoping the next game addresses. The comment section on these videos is one of my favorite things about making them. If there is a story in the Resident Evil universe that you want to see covered in this format, drop it in the comments. The Outbreak games, the full history of the connections, the complete timeline of Project W, Leon's full story from Raccoon City to the Ark. There is so much lore in this franchise, and we have barely touched the surface. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourself, get some sleep, and we will see each other next time.